Around 2925 BC, the lands along the Nile experienced a decisive transformation when the regions known as Upper and Lower Egypt were brought together under a single rule. This union marked the beginning of an extraordinary cultural flowering and opened a line of native kings that would endure for nearly 3 millennia. Scholars later organized this immense span into the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, a sequence of about 30 dynasties that lasted until the arrival of foreign conquerors in 332 BC. Egypt's stability was interrupted in the 7th century BC by Assyrian armies, and 2 centuries later the Persian king Cambyses II absorbed the country into the Achaemenid Empire. A new chapter began with the arrival of Alexander of Macedon, whose conquest introduced a Greek-speaking elite, and the Ptolemaic dynasty. The city he founded, Alexandria, soon grew into one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world, where Greek philosophy mingled with Semitic traditions and produced remarkable advances in science and learning. Roman rule followed in 30 BC and continued for more than 400 years. When the empire divided, Egypt became part of the Eastern Roman realm that would later be called Byzantine. The spread of Christianity gained momentum after imperial tolerance was granted in the 4th century, and Alexandria became home to influential theologians, whose debates shaped early Christian thought. Byzantine authority ended in 642 when Arab armies completed their conquest after years of fighting. Over the following centuries, Egypt gradually adopted the Arabic language and Islam became the dominant faith. The country passed through the hands of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates and later formed the heart of the Fatimid state, enjoying periods of independence and prosperity. In 1171, power returned to the Abbasids, yet within decades military slaves known as Mamluks seized control and created a dynasty that ruled until the Ottoman conquest of 1517. Under the Ottomans, Egypt was reduced to the status of a province, and economic and cultural decline set in. The modern era began abruptly with the French invasion of 1798, an episode that, although short, drew Egypt into European power politics. After the French withdrawal, authority gradually fell to Muhammad Ali, an ambitious soldier who established his own dynasty while acknowledging Ottoman sovereignty. His drive to modernize and expand the state left Egypt burdened with debt, and British forces occupied the country in 1882 during a period of internal turmoil. Britain soon installed a resident administrator to guide Egyptian affairs, effectively placing the country under foreign control while maintaining the facade of Ottoman suzerainty. Initial opposition to the occupation was limited, yet the situation changed when a young ruler, Abbas II, ascended the throne in 1892. Determined to assert his authority, he clashed repeatedly with the British representative, whose interference in cabinet appointments and military matters humiliated the monarchy. At the same time, a new generation of educated Egyptians began to articulate nationalist ideas. One of the most prominent voices was Mustafa Kemal, who used newspapers and speeches to awaken a sense of Egyptian identity centered on the Khedive and hostility toward foreign domination. Campaigns to reconquer the Sudan and agreements that left real control in British hands deepened nationalist resentment. The Entente between Britain and France in 1904 gave London a free hand in Egypt, weakening the alliance between Kemal and the palace and pushing the movement toward a broader anti-imperial agenda. Although British authority appeared secure, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Many educated Egyptians found their career prospects blocked by a growing British bureaucracy, while officials in London viewed themselves as guardians of the rural population. The clash of these perceptions exploded in 1906, when a confrontation in the village of Dinshaway led to the death of a British officer and the harsh punishment of local peasants. The incident outraged public opinion and hastened the retirement of the long-serving administrator. His successor attempted a more conciliatory policy, seeking cooperation with the Khedive and Mahdist reforms. Yet he faced resistance from both British officials and Egyptian nationalists. By 1911, a tougher approach returned, symbolised by the arrival of Lord Kitchener and the creation of a more assertive legislative body that would later nurture new political leaders. The outbreak of the First World War transformed Egypt's status. Britain declared a protectorate, deposed Abbas II, and installed a compliant sultan. Martial law silenced nationalist activity, but the end of the war revived demands for self-government. Saad Zaghloul and other politicians sought permission to present Egypt's case abroad, yet their arrest ignited nationwide revolt. Faced with unrest, London proclaimed independence in 1922, while reserving control over defence, communications, foreign interests, and the Sudan. A constitutional monarchy was established the following year, introducing elections and a parliament. But real power remained contested among the king, the Wafd Party, and the British authorities. Throughout the 1920s, politics revolved around this uneasy triangle. The Wafd, led by Zaghloul, commanded mass support and called for full sovereignty, while the monarch manoeuvred to preserve his prerogatives. Britain alternated between backing the palace and negotiating with the nationalists to protect imperial interests, especially the Suez Canal. Short-lived governments followed one another, treaties were drafted and abandoned, and periods of parliamentary rule were repeatedly interrupted by royal decrees. After Zaghloul's death, the movement fragmented, and by the early 1930s, a more authoritarian regime suspended the constitution. Only in 1936, with a new king on the throne and European tensions rising, did Britain agree to a treaty that formally ended the occupation while maintaining a military alliance. The young monarch Farouk soon quarrelled with the Wafd, and domestic politics grew increasingly turbulent. Rival youth movements clashed in the streets, and the approach of the Second World War brought further instability. Britain intervened once more to ensure a cooperative cabinet, culminating in a dramatic confrontation in 1942 that forced Farouk to reinstall the Wafd leader. The episode discredited both the monarchy and the nationalists, and corruption scandals weakened public trust. By the war's end, Egypt faced economic hardship, social unrest, and a rising tide of radical movements, most notably the Muslim Brotherhood. Post-war governments struggled to revise the treaty and remove British troops from the Canal Zone. Negotiations failed, and appeals to the United Nations brought no relief. Meanwhile, Egypt became deeply involved in the Arab struggle over Palestine and helped found the Arab League. The defeat in the war against the newly created State of Israel in 1948 shocked the nation and intensified political violence. Prime ministers were assassinated, the Muslim Brotherhood was suppressed, and protests spread across the cities. By the early 1950s, anger in Egypt was no longer aimed at a single target. Many people had grown tired of palace scandals, broken promises, and party politics that seemed to protect insiders rather than the public. The humiliation of the Arab-Israeli war deepened this mood, and the continuing presence of British troops around the Canal Zone made independence feel unfinished. Inside the army, resentment hardened into conviction. A growing number of officers concluded that the country had been mismanaged from the top, and they blamed the king's excesses and the political class's corruption for military weakness and national disgrace. On July 23, 1952, that frustration turned into action. A secret group calling itself the Free Officers moved against the monarchy, forcing King Farouk to step down and leave the country. Power shifted quickly into military hands. A new ruling body, dominated by a small circle of officers, presented itself as a revolutionary leadership determined to end the old order. At first, a senior figure, Muhammad Naguib, was placed at the head of the state, giving the movement a familiar and reassuring face. Behind the scenes, however, Gamal Abdel Nasser was steadily becoming the centre of gravity. For many observers at the time, his influence was not immediately obvious. The new regime spoke in collective terms, kept internal roles blurred, and projected unity. That surface unity did not last. Within months, the leadership began to split over what the revolution should become. Naguib, supported by parts of the urban middle class and groups hoping for a rapid return to parliamentary life, favoured a quick transition back to constitutional rule. Others argued that the old parties and old institutions were too compromised to be trusted again. Tensions escalated into a struggle for authority. Naguib resigned at one point, then returned under pressure from civilian and military supporters who feared instability. Yet, the balance was shifting. Nasser built strength inside the armed forces and expanded influence beyond them, drawing support from security institutions and segments of organised labour. By the end of this power contest, Naguib was removed from real authority and placed under confinement, while Nasser stepped forward openly as Prime Minister and the unquestioned leader of the new state. In the first years after the takeover, the regime moved carefully on several major foreign issues. Sudan, long tied to Egypt, but increasingly shaped by competing claims, was placed on a path towards self-rule and then independence, which was achieved in 1956. With Britain, negotiations produced an agreement for the staged withdrawal of troops from the Canal Zone, a goal that had eluded earlier governments. But the question of Israel proved far more volatile. Egypt was drawn into a cycle of cross-border violence that steadily increased the risk of a wider war. Raids and infiltrations along the border, some connected to fighters operating from Gaza, triggered harsh Israeli retaliation. Each clash intensified pressure on Cairo to rearm and to demonstrate resolve in the wider Arab arena. Arms became a turning point. After unsuccessful attempts to secure substantial weapons from Western suppliers, Egypt announced a major deal through Czechoslovakia, widely understood as a channel for Soviet support. The agreement altered regional balances and signalled that Cairo was willing to break out of Western influence if necessary. Relations with the United States and Britain deteriorated further when promised funding for the Aswan High Dam was withdrawn. The leadership answered with a dramatic move. In July 1956, Egypt declared that the Suez Canal Company would be brought under national control, and that canal revenues would be used to finance national development. For many Egyptians, this was an act of sovereignty. For Britain and France, it was an unacceptable challenge. A plan took shape that combined diplomatic pressure with military action, and Israel entered the crisis as well, citing ongoing raids and security threats. War followed in late 1956. Israel struck into Sinai, and Britain and France intervened soon after, claiming the need to secure the canal and restore order. Yet the intervention ran into overwhelming international resistance. Both Washington and Moscow pushed for an end to the assault, and the attackers withdrew. Militarily, Egypt absorbed serious damage, but politically, Nasser emerged strengthened at home and admired in much of the Arab world for having kept control of the canal. To reduce the risk of renewed clashes, international peacekeepers were placed between Egyptian and Israeli forces in Sinai, creating a tense but temporary buffer. Inside Egypt, power was being tightened. An assassination attempt against Nasser in 1954 was used to justify a sweeping crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. Many members were imprisoned, and the organisation was pushed out of legal political life. The state then moved to formalize a new political system. A constitution announced in 1956 framed Egypt as an Arab, socialist-leaning republic with a single-party structure and Islam recognized as the state religion. A national vote followed in which Nasser stood as the only presidential candidate and won an overwhelming result. The regime presented this as popular endorsement and a mandate for transformation. The ambition to lead beyond Egypt's borders soon became part of the story. In 1958, Egypt and Syria merged into a single state, hoping to embody Arab unity in concrete form. The experiment quickly exposed deep tensions. Syrians increasingly resented the dominance of Egyptian institutions and decision-making, and the union collapsed in 1961. The breakup left bitterness across the region and hardened Cairo's sense that internal reaction and external pressure were conspiring against Arab unity. After the union failed, Egypt's domestic direction shifted more sharply towards state control. The early 1960s brought a wave of nationalizations and seizures. Major industries, banks, transport networks, and large parts of the financial system came under government authority. The state aimed to direct development from the top, using planning and public ownership to reshape society. These years did produce visible changes. Industrial output grew and manufacturing expanded as a share of the economy. At the same time, agriculture struggled to keep pace, and rapid population growth strained resources and services. The regime's promise was modernization, but the realities of land, water, and food supply proved stubborn. Political life, meanwhile, remained tightly managed, with opposition either banned or pushed underground. Across the border, Sinai stayed quiet only in a fragile way. The presence of peacekeepers reduced immediate clashes, yet Egyptian leaders never treated the Israeli threat as distant. Military planning and diplomacy were shaped by the fear of another sudden war. Cairo cultivated close ties with the Soviet bloc for weapons and training, while also attempting to rally Arab cooperation. Those efforts often ran into rivalries among Arab capitals, but Nasser's speeches and radio broadcasts still carried enormous influence. Strong rhetoric became a tool to preserve leadership status in the Arab world, even when actual policy remained cautious. Over time, however, pressures built that made caution harder to sustain. A major strain came from Yemen. In the early 1960s, Egypt intervened in Yemen's civil war in support of Republican forces. The conflict drained resources, cost lives, and pulled Cairo into confrontation with Saudi Arabia, which backed the royalist side. The United States, aligned with Saudi interests, reduced support for Egypt, tightening economic pressure. Meanwhile, Palestinian attacks against Israel increased from several fronts, especially from Syria, and Israeli retaliation inflamed public opinion across the Arab world. Within this atmosphere, Nasser faced accusations of hiding behind the international buffer in Sinai. The challenge was not only strategic, but also symbolic. Leadership in Arab politics demanded visible firmness. In 1967, the crisis accelerated. Egypt demanded the removal of the peacekeeping force from Sinai, and as international troops withdrew, Egyptian forces moved into positions that had been previously restricted. When control also loosened near Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt blocked Israeli shipping through the Gulf of Aqaba. Israel had repeatedly stated that such a blockade would be treated as an act of war. On June 5th, Israel launched a sudden attack against Egypt and its allies, describing it as preemptive. In the first hours, Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The shock spread rapidly across the front. The army retreated from Sinai, and within days Israel controlled the peninsula. The losses were severe, and the defeat was widely felt as a national catastrophe. the aftermath shook the regime to its core. Nasser announced that he would resign, but mass demonstrations demanded that he remain, and a formal vote of confidence reinforced his return. The government moved quickly to rebuild military capacity with Soviet assistance. Weapons were replaced, training intensified, and air defense systems were installed along the canal to protect positions and limit Israeli air superiority. Soon, the canal zone became a front line again. A prolonged, grinding exchange of artillery, raids, and airstrikes followed, later remembered as a war of attrition, rather than a single decisive battle. At the diplomatic level, the leadership explored peace proposals cautiously, balancing domestic expectations, Arab politics, and the reality of military imbalance. After Nasser's death in 1970, power passed to his vice president, Anwar el-Sadat, another officer from the same revolutionary circle that had seized control in 1952. Many inside Egypt and abroad assumed he would be a temporary figure, someone who would hold the chair until stronger men reshuffled the system. Instead, Sadat proved far more resilient than expected. In May 1971, he moved decisively against a powerful bloc of rivals and security heavyweights, breaking their influence and presenting the shake-up as a national reset. From that moment, the direction of the Republic began to change. Some elements of the previous era continued, but the tone, alliances, and priorities started to shift, and Sadat made it clear he intended to rule in his own name. One of his most dramatic choices came in foreign policy. Sadat increasingly felt that Moscow's backing was cautious and conditional, and that it did not deliver the leverage Egypt needed in its confrontation with Israel. In 1972, he ordered the departure of thousands of Soviet advisors and technicians, a decision that signaled both frustration and a willingness to gamble. At the same time, he tested a diplomatic opening with Israel, indicating that a settlement might be possible if the Sinai Peninsula were returned. When this initiative produced no breakthrough, Cairo turned to war as a way to change the political equation. In October 1973, Egypt, coordinating with Syria, launched a surprise offensive to regain territory lost years earlier. Egyptian forces achieved an early tactical success that stunned Israel and shifted the mood across the Arab world, even though Israel soon stabilized the front and counterattacked. The fighting ended under heavy international pressure, with the United States pushing a ceasefire that froze the battlefield before it could settle into a decisive outcome for either side. Sadat understood the war in political terms as much as military ones. Egypt had not defeated Israel in the classic sense, but the opening shock of October allowed him to argue that national honor had been restored and that negotiation could now be pursued without appearing weak. In the years that followed, he moved steadily, sometimes against the anxieties of allies, towards step-by-step agreements. Disengagement deals in 1974 and 1975 eased the immediate military standoff, brought parts of Sinai back under Egyptian control, and unlocked large flows of external financial support. Yet the broader Arab-Israeli settlement remained blocked by distrust, domestic pressures, and the unwillingness of key actors to take visible risks. When talks stalled again, Sadat made a move that few thought possible. In November 1977, he flew to Jerusalem and spoke directly to Israel's parliament. The gesture shattered old taboos and triggered a new diplomatic sprint, even as it provoked fury across much of the Arab world and deepened hostility from the Soviet bloc. American mediation then became central. President Jimmy Carter hosted intense negotiations between Sadat and Israel's Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, leading to the Camp David framework in 1978 and soon after a formal peace treaty in March 1979. It was the first time an Arab state signed a full peace agreement with Israel. The treaty mapped a full Israeli withdrawal from Sinai within a fixed timetable and created special security rules intended to prevent a new war. International forces would monitor key zones, and both sides committed to normal diplomatic and economic relations, including the exchange of ambassadors. For Egypt, the decision carried a heavy price. Arab financial support shrank sharply, and Egypt found itself isolated in regional politics for a time, including suspension from the Arab League. Only years later did most Arab governments begin to restore ties, and Egypt's place in regional institutions gradually returned. Sadat tied this new diplomacy to a promise of rebuilding at home. He argued that Egypt needed investment, trade, and a more flexible economy, and he announced an open-door approach designed to pull in Western and Arab capital. The plan aimed to loosen the tight state grip of the previous era, encourage private enterprise and diversify economic life beyond old bureaucratic structures. In practice, the results divided society. Inflation rose, wealth accumulated unevenly, and many Egyptians saw new privileges forming around people with access to the right connections. Inequality became harder to ignore. Still, peace also brought tangible relief through expanded external assistance, especially a large American aid relationship that grew into a major financial pillar by the early 1980s. Political life appeared to open slightly on paper. A constitution introduced in 1971 offered language that emphasized rights and participation, and later reforms allowed the creation of political parties. Yet the daily experience of many Egyptians was shaped less by legal texts than by prices, jobs, and the sense that the system was still controlled from the top. When the government tried to reduce subsidies and shift the burden onto ordinary households, public anger exploded. In January 1977, protests and riots swept major cities. The clashes were violent, leaving dozens dead and many more injured or detained. The message was unmistakable. Economic pressure could ignite the streets, and political reforms alone would not calm a population struggling to afford basic necessities. During the same period, religious activism expanded in new ways. Under Nasser, the Muslim Brotherhood had been heavily repressed. Under Sadat, restrictions eased, many prisoners were released, and religious groups found more space to preach and organize. This opening, combined with social strain and political polarization, contributed to a rise in extremist currents. Violence increasingly targeted state institutions and also struck Egypt's Coptic Christian community, intensifying fears of sectarian conflict. Radical groups formed with the explicit aim of overthrowing the secular state, and some carried out attacks intended to shock society and prove the government's weakness. By the early 1980s, Sadat faced opposition from many directions. Critics who rejected the peace with Israel, citizens battered by economic hardship, and militants who saw his state as illegitimate. As dissent grew, Sadat responded with force. In September 1981, a mass crackdown swept across the political spectrum. Thousands were arrested, including Islamists, leftists, liberals, and figures linked to older power networks. The repression did not restore stability. 1 month later, during a military parade marking the anniversary of the 1973 war, Sadat was assassinated by soldiers connected to a militant Islamist movement. The killing was a national shock, but the immediate public reaction was less a wave of chaos than a tense stillness, as if society was bracing for what would come next. Sadat's successor was Hosni Mubarak, a senior Air Force officer closely associated with the 1973 war, and with the leadership circle that had governed since the early 1970s. In his first year, he adopted a calm, careful tone, emphasizing order and continuity. Foreign policy remained anchored in close ties with the United States, which had become Egypt's most important external patron. The peace with Israel was maintained, and in 1982 Sinai was formally returned to Egyptian sovereignty under the treaty's timetable. Yet relations with Israel soon cooled as new regional crises reshaped public opinion, especially after Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Diplomatic contact did not vanish, but warmth was replaced by suspicion, and Egypt positioned itself as a cautious actor rather than an enthusiastic partner. Over time, Mubarak worked to repair Egypt's standing in the Arab world. With patience and careful signalling, ties with several Arab governments improved, and regional institutions slowly reopened their doors. By the late 1980s, the path toward reintegration was clear, and Egypt's formal place in Arab diplomacy was restored. At home, Mubarak promised to curb the influence of the wealthy networks that had flourished under the open-door era. He also released many political detainees while ordering security forces to pursue the militants who had planned Sadat's assassination. Even so, discontent persisted. Strikes, food protests, and periodic unrest continued, driven by the same underlying pressures: wages, prices, unemployment, and mistrust in a political system that offered limited, genuine competition. The economy deteriorated further in the late 1980s as money sent home by Egyptians working abroad declined. Debt mounted, and the state leaned increasingly on external assistance. International financial institutions gained more influence over economic policy, pushing reforms that included currency devaluations, higher interest rates, and reductions in subsidies. These measures hit the poorest hardest and widened the gap between rich and poor. As inequality became more visible, social resentment grew. Meanwhile, politics moved in an increasingly controlled direction. Presidential renewals came again and again, often without serious challenge, and the ruling party continued to dominate parliament. Many Egyptians believed elections were managed to protect the system, feeding cynicism and weakening the credibility of official institutions. Violence from Islamist militants remained a constant threat through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Officials were attacked, tourists were targeted near major historical sites, and one assassination attempt abroad nearly killed Mubarak in 1995. A particularly brutal assault at Luxor in 1997 signalled the militants' willingness to strike at the heart of Egypt's tourism economy. The government answered with sweeping security tactics: mass arrests, long detentions, and harsh interrogation methods that human rights groups condemned. For a time, these measures reduced the insurgent threat, but they also deepened grievances and kept the country trapped between fear of instability and anger at repression. Alongside political and economic strain, another fault line periodically surfaced: the relationship between the Muslim majority and the Coptic Christian minority. Publicly, many Egyptians insisted on national unity and tried to contain sectarian tension. But accusations and mistrust simmered beneath the surface. Some Muslims claimed that Copts held unfair economic power or served foreign interests, while some Copts complained of discrimination, attacks on churches, and pressure to abandon their faith. Clashes flared at intervals, sometimes sparked by local disputes, that escalated into wider violence. In 2009, a controversial government order led to the mass slaughter of pigs, raised largely by Coptic farmers. Officially justified as a public health measure during global flu fears. Many Copts viewed it as an economic punishment rooted in prejudice, especially since international health authorities rejected the idea that the animals were driving human infection. In early 2010, sectarian shock returned again after gunmen killed worshippers outside a church following a holiday service. an attack that underscored how fragile communal peace could become when politics, fear, and rumour combined. Libya is a country where geography shapes everything. Most of its territory is desert, and for long stretches of history, only narrow coastal zones and a few interior oases could support large, settled communities. That reality kept the population relatively small and made it difficult for any single inland heartland to dominate the rest. Even the name Libya, now taken for granted, is surprisingly modern, fixed as an administrative label during the Italian colonial period in the 20th century. Before that, the lands that later became Libya often looked outward rather than inward. The western coast around Tripoli tended to orbit the Maghreb and Tunisia, while the eastern region around Benghazi and the uplands of Cyrenaica had deeper connections to Egypt. For much of the pre-modern era, these zones were not tightly bound together, and even under Ottoman rule, the territory functioned as separate administrative worlds, rather than a unified state. Modern Libya, in other words, did not emerge because centuries of shared institutions naturally fused the land into one country. It formed through a cluster of relatively recent forces that pushed disparate regions into a single political frame. A religious and social movement based in the east began to spread new networks of loyalty across wide spaces. Then, Italian conquest imposed a single colonial structure by force. After the Second World War, Libya reached independence partly because the international powers could not agree on a different arrangement. Finally, oil, found in huge quantities just as the new state was trying to define itself, altered everything. Wealth arrived suddenly, accelerating social change and intensifying political stakes. This combination of weak historical integration, abrupt colonial disruption, and rapid resource wealth helps explain why Libya's modern identity developed with such a distinctive character. From the early 16th century, the territory was tied to the Ottoman Empire, but the relationship was not always direct or uniform. In the 18th century, a local dynasty, the Kairouans, ruled with a degree of autonomy, reflecting a pattern seen elsewhere along the North African coast. When disorder and succession disputes weakened local authority, Istanbul reasserted tighter control in 1835. For the next decades, officials sent from the imperial capital oversaw the region and introduced limited reforms typical of the late Ottoman world. Yet the most consequential development of that period did not come from government offices. It emerged from religious and social organization. In 1837, an Islamic brotherhood known as the Sanusiya was founded, preaching strict piety and practical discipline, while also offering education and material support. It created a chain of lodges that acted as religious centers, supply hubs, and meeting points, encouraging cooperation among communities scattered across vast distances. The movement's earliest stronghold was in Cyrenaica, where it established a lodge near the ancient ruins of Cyrene and expanded through the eastern countryside and into parts of the south. Its leadership shifted deeper into the desert, first toward an oasis near the Egyptian frontier, then later, farther into the Sahara, creating a base that could organize trade routes and tribal alliances beyond the reach of coastal politics. Ottoman authorities sometimes valued the movement as a barrier against European expansion from the south. Yet they also watched it warily because it generated a political influence that did not depend on the state. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was under pressure on multiple fronts, and reform movements inside the empire competed with external threats. In 1911, Italy invaded, motivated by strategic ambitions and economic interests. Ottoman rulers accepted a peace settlement the following year. But the end of imperial rule did not mean the end of resistance. Italy discovered that holding coastal towns was one thing. controlling an interior shaped by tribal loyalties and religious networks was another. Armed opposition continued through the First World War and into the post-war years. Rome explored deals with local leaders in the west and with the Sanussia in the east, but compromise collapsed as Italian policy hardened. After a fascist government took power in Italy, colonization became more aggressive and systematic. Tripolitania was brought under firmer control in the early 1920s. In Cyrenaica, however, resistance linked to the Sanusi order continued under the leadership of Umar al-Mukhtar, whose guerrilla campaign turned him into a symbol of defiance. His capture and execution in 1931 marked the breaking point of organized armed resistance, achieved at enormous human cost. Italy then attempted to remake the colony. During the 1920s and 1930s, the colonial administration poured money into roads, towns, and agricultural settlements designed for Italian immigrants. The most ambitious phase aimed at transforming the demographic balance, encouraging large numbers of settlers to move in and establish farming colonies along the coast. By the eve of the Second World War, Italian settlers numbered in the hundreds of thousands, forming a significant share of the population and reshaping the coastal economy around colonial priorities. Yet this experiment was fragile. When war swept across North Africa, Libya became a battlefield. Front lines moved repeatedly, especially in Cyrenaica, which changed hands multiple times. Infrastructure and settlements were battered or destroyed, settlers fled, and much of the economic structure built during the colonial period collapsed. By the end of the war, the territory was impoverished and fragmented, with the west, east, and southern interior each carrying different experiences, institutions, and social patterns. The question of Libya's future became an international puzzle. Various plans circulated: continued Italian oversight, international trusteeship, partition, or mandates under different powers. Meanwhile, the Sanusi movement had gained political credibility because a volunteer force linked to it had fought alongside the Allies, and British officials had signalled that the movement's followers would not be forced back under Italian rule. After years of debate, the international community backed a solution that surprised many. Libya would become a single independent kingdom within a short deadline. A federal constitution was drafted to balance regional differences, and Idris, the leading Sanusi figure, was chosen as king. Independence was declared in December 1951. The new monarchy carried built-in tensions. Political parties were banned, and real power rested with the king. Many in Tripolitania accepted the monarchy, not because the Sanusi tradition was rooted in the West, but because it seemed the best available path to unity and independence. Idris himself preferred the East and spent much of his time there, reinforcing perceptions of regional imbalance. In foreign affairs, the kingdom leaned toward the West, joining Arab regional institutions while maintaining arrangements with Western powers. The state was poor, dependent on aid and on the rent paid for foreign military facilities, and it lacked the administrative depth that older states had built over centuries. Everything changed with oil. In 1959, commercial discoveries turned Libya from a struggling, aid-dependent kingdom into a country with rapidly rising income. Oil fields in both the western and eastern regions ensured that wealth would not be concentrated in only one zone. But the speed of the transformation created its own problems. State services expanded dramatically. Roads and buildings multiplied. Wages rose and cities grew. At the same time, living costs climbed, social expectations hardened, and political legitimacy became tied to how oil money was distributed. The monarchy struggled to adapt to this new reality. Discontent increased, fueled by regional rivalries, generational frustration, and anger over the broader Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1967, as the Six-Day War shook the Arab world, the king's cautious posture toward Israel became a point of outrage for many Libyans. 2 years later, in September 1969, a group of young officers led by Muammar al-Gaddafi overthrew the monarchy and declared a republic. The new regime defined itself through militant Arab nationalism. It broke the kingdom's close relationship with Britain and the United States and pressed hard to increase Libyan control over oil. Foreign companies were forced into new arrangements that raised prices and expanded Libyan participation. And in some cases, assets were taken into state hands. The government also promoted ambitious visions of Arab unity. Plans were announced with neighbouring states and distant partners alike: Egypt, Sudan, Tunisia, and later others. Yet these projects repeatedly collapsed as competing interests and mistrust surfaced. Despite public slogans about unity, relations with many Arab governments worsened. Armed clashes even erupted with Egypt in 1977, and large numbers of Egyptian workers were expelled from Libya. A later union treaty with Morocco was signed with fanfare and then abandoned within a short time. Another example of grand declarations outpacing political reality. Inside Libya, Gaddafi pushed a radical model of governance, claiming that traditional state institutions would be replaced by direct rule through popular bodies. In 1977, the country was rebranded under a new ideological label, meant to convey government by the masses. Official politics became a staged performance of participation, while real authority remained concentrated around the leader and his security networks. During the early years, oil wealth helped fund ambitious social programs and allowed the regime to project influence abroad. Libya supported Palestinian factions and a range of revolutionary movements across Africa and the Middle East. These interventions won admiration among some supporters, but also generated enemies, isolating the country from Western governments and alarming several Arab states. By the early 1980s, Libya's freedom of action narrowed. Oil prices weakened, reducing revenue and slowing the regime's ability to finance sweeping plans. Domestic dissatisfaction became more visible, and opposition groups attempted sporadic attacks. The state replied with arrests, harsh repression, and public punishment intended to deter dissent. At the same time, confrontation with the United States escalated. Washington accused Libya of supporting militant groups and responded with economic pressure and military measures. Tensions climaxed in 1986 when American aircraft bombed targets in Tripoli and Benghazi, an attack that caused civilian casualties and deepened Libya's sense of siege. Claims that Libya sought chemical weapons added another layer of hostility between Libya and Western powers. Libya also pursued a regional conflict far from its coastal cities. The struggle over the Ayazu Strip along the border with Chad. The dispute produced years of intermittent fighting and drew in external powers, including France and the United States. Libya's forces eventually suffered setbacks against more mobile Chadian troops, and later, diplomacy rolled the conflict back. Over time, Libya accepted an international legal decision that awarded the contested territory to Chad, signalling a shift away from open military expansion. A larger crisis arrived through international sanctions. Libya was accused of involvement in the destruction of a civilian airliner over Lockerbie in 1988, and the 1990s brought punishing economic restrictions imposed by the United States and the United Nations. The pressure isolated Libya financially and politically, restricting travel, trade, and access to global systems. By the late 1990s, Libya began a slow reversal, handing suspects over for international trial and signalling a desire to resolve disputes, with the outside world. Sanctions were lifted in 2003, and Libya announced that it would abandon programs linked to chemical weapons. Washington responded by removing many of its restrictions, and full diplomatic ties were restored in the mid-2000s. A highly publicized medical case involving foreign health workers was also diffused through an eventual transfer and pardon abroad, removing another obstacle to Libya's re-entry into international life. At the far northwest edge of Africa, Morocco sits close enough to Europe that the Spanish coast can appear across the water on a clear day. Yet throughout its long history, the country repeatedly proved difficult to absorb. Its position turned it into a corridor and a crossroads, where Atlantic winds, Mediterranean routes, and Saharan roads all met, and where European, Middle Eastern, and African influences constantly brushed against one another, without ever fully cancelling the local character. Long before the modern state took shape, the land was home to Tamazight-speaking communities, many of them organised in mobile tribal networks. During a brief Roman presence along parts of the coast, new religions arrived, and small numbers of people adopted Christianity and Judaism. But the deeper turning point came in the late 7th century, when armies and preachers from the east brought Islam. Over time, local Amazigh groups embraced the new faith and made it their own, blending it into older social structures and regional identities. In the medieval period, Morocco became a major power in the Western Islamic world. Competing religious currents existed at different moments, but by the 12th and 13th centuries, a strict Sunni orthodoxy was promoted under the Almohads, whose reformist zeal shaped law, scholarship, and public life. Meanwhile, events north of the sea began to echo across Moroccan cities. As Christian kingdoms in Iberia expanded southward, waves of Muslim and Jewish refugees crossed into Morocco, carrying skills, tastes, and memories that left a lasting Andalusian stamp on urban culture. The ports and medinas of Morocco absorbed this influx, and in many places architecture, music, crafts, and manners took on a distinctly Hispano-Maghrebi flavour. Still, European powers struggled to turn influence into lasting control. A handful of coastal footholds existed, but most attempts to impose permanent rule met resistance. That pattern continued into the early modern era. In the 16th century, forces connected to the Ottoman world, advancing from Algeria, tried to extend their reach westward. Morocco resisted. The country remained almost unique among Arab lands in never being incorporated into Ottoman administration. A dramatic moment came in 1578 near Qasr el-Kebir, where a battle involving Portuguese and Moroccan forces ended with the deaths of rival rulers, including the Portuguese king, Sebastian. The fight became a powerful symbol in Moroccan memory. It halted European ambitions for centuries and reinforced the idea that Morocco could defend its autonomy even against determined outside powers. By the 17th century, a new ruling house emerged that still governs Morocco today. The Alawite dynasty positioned itself as both political leadership and religious authority, claiming legitimacy through descent and sacred prestige. Under this dynasty, Morocco strengthened trade and diplomacy across several directions at once, maintaining connections with sub-Saharan Africa, the Arab East, and Europe. Relations with Christian powers were often tense, shaped by piracy, ransom, and border disputes. Yet commerce and diplomacy continued in spite of ideological hostility. By the end of the 17th century, Morocco's identity as an Islamic monarchy was solidified, and the image of a commanding sultan became central to how the state held together. That image reached its clearest expression under Moulay Ismail, who ruled from the late 17th into the early 18th century. Determined to impose order on a country marked by tribal competition and regional autonomy, he built a powerful army recruited from enslaved soldiers and used it to force obedience across the realm. His reign strengthened centralized authority and left behind fortifications, administrative structures, and a sense that the Sultan could be the ultimate arbiter of internal conflict. After him, later rulers often relied on the same principle. Religious prestige and royal ritual could restrain rival tribes and competing power brokers, even if the centre never fully controlled every mountain valley or desert track. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Morocco entered a quieter phase. While Europe was consumed by revolution and continent-wide warfare, Morocco turned inward. Despite the narrow strait separating the two worlds, mutual knowledge remained limited. Europeans often imagined Morocco through fantasy and rumour, while many Moroccans saw Europe as distant and unpredictable. That distance collapsed in the 19th century as European empires expanded into North Africa and gradually tightened pressure on Morocco. The French conquest of Algeria in 1830 changed the balance overnight. Morocco's Sultan at the time briefly moved troops toward the Algerian frontier, but withdrew under French pressure. Soon, the Algerian resistance leader, Abd al-Qadir, sought refuge on Moroccan soil as French forces pursued him. This drew Morocco into direct conflict. In 1844, French forces bombarded Moroccan ports and crushed a Moroccan army near the frontier. The result was a humiliating demonstration of European military power. Morocco promised to restrain Abd al-Qadir, and when he later crossed into Morocco again, Moroccan troops attacked him, forcing his surrender to the French. The episode left Morocco weaker, more exposed, and more aware that it faced an era of imperial encirclement. Spain then applied its own pressure. A boundary dispute around Ceuta escalated into war, and Spanish forces captured Tetuan in 1860. Morocco bought peace at a severe cost, a heavy indemnity, expanded Spanish frontiers, and commitments that increased European leverage along the coast. Moroccan rulers attempted modernization, especially of the army, but reform collided with realities on the ground. Limited finances, factional politics, and the difficulty of building a modern bureaucracy in a society where many regions answered first to tribal leadership. By the late 19th century, internal problems deepened. A young sultan ascended under the shadow of palace power brokers, and for years real authority rested with a strong chamberlain ruling in the monarch's name. When the Sultan began governing directly, he leaned toward European advisors and adopted foreign customs that shocked religious leaders and alienated many subjects. His attempt to introduce new taxes and administrative reforms produced confusion rather than stability, largely because the state lacked trained officials and reliable enforcement. Rebellions spread, and rival claimants set up alternative courts, presenting themselves as defenders of tradition against a palace seen as compromised. European governments used Morocco's instability as an opening. Diplomatic deals between the major powers gradually divided the country into zones of influence on paper, before a protectorate existed on the ground. Britain accepted French predominance in Morocco in exchange for French non-interference elsewhere. Spain secured recognition of special interests in the north. Other European states obtained assurances that their ambitions in different parts of North Africa would not be obstructed. International conferences followed, declaring respect for Moroccan sovereignty, while simultaneously granting Europeans control over policing ports, collecting customs, and shaping financial policy. Morocco remained nominally independent, but the machinery of control was increasingly external. Inside the country, the political crisis became a succession struggle. A brother of the Sultan led a revolt from Marrakesh, denouncing the court's submission to Europeans. The deposed ruler fled, and the new Sultan was recognized by European governments. Yet recognition did not bring control. Disorder worsened, and when the Sultan found himself besieged in Fez by tribal forces, he called on French troops to rescue him. After the intervention, Morocco's remaining autonomy collapsed into legal form. In March 1912, a treaty created a French protectorate. The Sultan's position was preserved as a symbol, but real authority shifted to a French resident administration. Spain received its own protectorate zone in the north, while Tangier became a special case with an international character. Morocco was now formally partitioned by foreign systems, even as the language of tradition was maintained. French rule in Morocco carried a distinctive style at first. The first resident general, Liaute, preferred to govern through co-optation rather than blunt replacement. He sought to keep the Moroccan elite in place, protect traditional institutions, and build new administrative cities alongside old Medinas, rather than demolish them. Rabat was developed as a political capital, Casablanca expanded into a major commercial port, and modern roads and services multiplied. European districts were built with their own planning and architecture, leaving historic quarters largely intact. Even the First World War did not fully interrupt this program, as French authorities managed to hold the territory despite debates in Paris about retreating to safer coastal positions. Yet France still faced major obstacles. Extending control into the Atlas and other outlying regions proved slow and costly, and it was not completed until the mid-1930s. In the Spanish zone, a fierce resistance movement led by Abd el-Krim spread beyond its initial base and forced both Spain and France into a major campaign to crush it. When Liaute was replaced in 1926 by a civilian administrator, policy shifted toward a more conventional colonial approach. European settlement expanded, official colonization increased, and the influence of French education on a younger Moroccan generation grew stronger. That younger generation began to organize. In Rabat and Fez, educated Moroccans met to discuss reform. More schools, modern courts, limits on the power of local strongmen, and an end to policies that favoured settlers. Many of these demands were framed as reforms within the protectorate system, rather than a full call for independence, at least at first. At the same time, the French administration attempted to exploit cultural divisions, presenting Amazigh and Arab identities as separate and legally distinct. A decree issued in 1930, designed to separate legal systems and weaken national unity, achieved the opposite effect. It provoked widespread outrage and helped crystallize a new nationalist mood, one that increasingly saw unity as essential to resisting colonial rule. The monarchy became an important symbol in this growing movement. After the death of the cooperating sultan in 1927, the French placed his younger son on the throne, expecting a compliant and quiet figure. Instead, the new sultan gradually showed diplomatic skill and a subtle determination that surprised observers. Nationalists created a public celebration of the throne anniversary to strengthen the bond between the monarch and the people. When the Sultan visited Fez in the mid-1930s, crowds welcomed him with intense enthusiasm, and demonstrations against French authority erupted. The administration reacted by cutting short his visit, an act that only increased the sense that the Sultan had become a focal point for Moroccan dignity. Meanwhile, social and economic tensions sharpened. In one city, riots broke out after settlers were accused of diverting water supplies for their own farms at the expense of local cultivators. French repression followed, and prominent nationalist figures were exiled far from Morocco. Despite arrests and bans, political groups continued to form, and the language of reform steadily shifted toward demands for real self-rule. When the Second World War began in 1939, Morocco was still living under a foreign protectorate, yet the Sultan's voice carried symbolic weight. He publicly urged cooperation with France, and large numbers of Moroccans, many of them Ahmadis from rural regions, were sent to fight in Europe. Their service became a point of pride, but the war soon overturned the political landscape. France's defeat in 1940 and the rise of the Vichy authorities created a tense new reality in North Africa. In Morocco, the Sultan began to signal that he would not simply follow orders. One of his clearest gestures came when discriminatory measures against Jews were proposed. He refused to endorse them, marking a line he would not cross even under pressure. The war reached Morocco directly in 1942 when Anglo-American forces landed on the coast. The colonial administration encouraged the Sultan to withdraw inland for safety, but he rejected the suggestion and remained where he was. A quiet display of resolve. The arrival of Allied troops also changed Moroccan society in subtle ways. For many people, it was the first time they had seen large numbers of foreign soldiers who were neither French settlers nor colonial officials. American and British troops brought money, goods, and a sense of a wider world that Moroccan civilians had rarely encountered at such scale. Radio broadcasts added another layer. Competing propaganda from both Allied and Axis stations often spoke warmly about Moroccan self-determination, and many listeners, especially Arabic speakers, were drawn to messages that hinted at independence and dignity. These wartime currents strengthened the nationalist movement and sharpened its language. A new name emerged that placed the goal front and centre, a party built around the idea of independence. In early 1944, its leaders presented a formal demand for sovereignty under a constitutional system, addressed not only to the Sultan but also to the foreign authorities who controlled the country. The colonial administration reacted harshly. Several nationalist figures were accused of working with the enemy, arrested, and punished. The charges were widely viewed as a pretext. Protests broke out in Fez and other towns, and security forces responded with violence that left demonstrators dead. The crackdown deepened the political divide and pushed the Sultan closer to a role he had not openly claimed before, the living symbol of national unity. By the late 1940s, the Sultan was carefully testing how far he could go without triggering outright removal. In 1947, he persuaded a new resident authority, more open to reform, to seek permission for him to travel officially to Tangier, passing through the Spanish-controlled zone on the way. The trip turned into a public spectacle. Crowds lined the roads, and the journey looked less like a routine visit than a national rally. In Tangier, the Sultan delivered a speech that deliberately emphasized Morocco's ties to the Arab and Islamic world. Missing from the speech was the kind of flattering language the French expected. The omission was heard as a message. Morocco's future would not be framed as permanent dependence. French policy hardened again soon after. A new military administrator arrived with deep experience in North Africa and a distrust of nationalist politics. He offered concessions that sounded modern, such as elected municipal councils in major cities, but then tried to insert French citizens as members of these bodies, guaranteeing colonial influence inside local institutions. The Sultan used one of the last real tools still available to him. Without his signature, key decrees had no legal force. He withheld approval and blocked measures he considered a direct threat to Moroccan autonomy. Even a ceremonial visit to France and polite treatment there did not soften his position. Returning home, he was greeted by huge crowds, reinforcing the sense that he had become more than a traditional monarch. He was becoming the public face of resistance. The struggle then moved into the palace itself. Colonial authorities explored alliances with powerful rural notables, especially in Amazigh regions, hoping to counter the urban nationalists. One of the most influential of these figures openly confronted the Sultan, accusing him of serving a political party rather than the nation. Soon, the pressure escalated. French troops surrounded the palace, while tribal contingents were gathered nearby under the claim of protecting the ruler from unrest. Under threat, the Sultan was pushed into a vague public statement distancing himself from unnamed political forces. Yet he still refused to sign many critical decrees, including measures that would have seated French citizens in municipal bodies. The heavy-handed tactics drew criticism even inside France, and colonial leadership changed again, but the basic conflict remained unresolved. By the early 1950s, the atmosphere in Morocco was combustible. In Casablanca, union activists called a major protest after news spread of a political killing in another North African protectorate. Demonstrations spiraled into clashes with police, followed by mass arrests. Hundreds of nationalists were detained for long periods without trial, deepening anger and radicalizing parts of the movement. Inside Morocco, a coalition of religious figures and influential notables began working openly for the Sultan's removal. Paris, distracted by domestic politics and struggling to stabilize its empire, attempted a compromise. The Sultan would hand legislative authority to a council that included French directors, and he would sign all blocked legislation. Even when the Sultan accepted these conditions, his opponents pressed for more. In August 1953, the crisis reached its breaking point. The Sultan and his family were deported, and a more compliant replacement was installed. The move backfired. Rather than weakening nationalist sentiment, it turned the exiled monarch into a national hero. The Spanish-controlled zone, which had not been consulted about the decision, quietly signalled disapproval. It soon became a refuge for activists and organisers escaping French arrests, giving the nationalist movement a safer rear base. France's position deteriorated further in 1954, when war erupted in Algeria. Suddenly, the French state faced a massive armed conflict next door, while Morocco was sliding toward rebellion. A new resident authority arrived with a conciliatory approach, but he was obstructed by hostile settlers and by officials who resisted any retreat. Negotiations were reopened, and Moroccan representatives were called to discussions in France. A plan emerged. The substitute sultan would step aside, a transitional council would be formed, and the exiled monarch would return to guide a constitutional settlement. Meanwhile, armed groups began attacking French posts near the Spanish zone, adding military pressure to the political crisis. Even some of the rural notables who had once opposed the Sultan began to change their stance. By late 1955, leading figures publicly stated that only the return of the legitimate monarch could calm the country. France agreed to allow the Sultan to form a constitutional government. In November, he returned to Rabat to a wave of celebration, and in early 1956, Morocco's independence was declared. A new government was formed that included representatives from different currents inside society. The colonial departments run by Europeans were converted into ministries headed by Moroccans. The machinery of rule changed hands rapidly, and the new state began the difficult work of turning a protectorate into a sovereign administration. While the French zone drew most attention, the Spanish zone had its own distinct history. Spain's protectorate stretched across the north, covering mountain country and key ports, and Spain also controlled a desert strip in the southwest. Spanish authorities installed a royal family representative as a nominal local head, surrounding him with an obedient administration that allowed Spain to act independently, while still claiming Morocco's unity on paper. Tangier, because of its diplomatic and commercial role, operated under a special international system for many years, briefly occupied by Spain during the Second World War before returning to its previous status after 1945. The Northern Protectorate had been turbulent in the early 20th century, especially in the Rif Mountains. A powerful local leader, part patriot and part warlord, resisted Spanish authority until he was captured by another figure who became the zone's most famous rebel. That rebel built a disciplined uprising, defeated Spanish forces in a major battle in 1921, and declared a republican experiment in the mountains. It took a massive, combined campaign by France and Spain to crush the movement, and the rebel leader was exiled in 1926. After that, the Spanish zone became comparatively quieter, stable enough that Spanish commanders could recruit Moroccan soldiers for Spain's own civil conflict in the 1930s. Spanish colonial methods differed from French ones in certain ways. Arabic schooling was encouraged, links to Egypt for religious education were supported, and the deliberate strategy of pitting Amazigh against Arab identity was less visible than in the French zone. Still, the Protectorate remained a colonial system, run by European departments and rural administrators. When the French exiled the Sultan in 1953, Spain refused to recognise the replacement as legitimate in its own zone. That decision turned the Spanish Protectorate into a political sanctuary, and nationalists used it to regroup. But Spain was caught off guard when France moved toward granting independence. Within months, Spain signed its own agreement ending the Protectorate in 1956. The transition was calmer than the French struggle. Yet, it brought disruption. Currency changes raised prices. French-speaking officials arriving from the former French zone created resentment, and unrest flared in the Rif in the late 1950s. Tangier also lost much of its earlier glamour as an international zone, and many European and Jewish residents departed, mirroring shifts in other North African cities after independence. Additional territories returned later. A southern strip was handed back in the late 1950s, and another enclave was relinquished in 1970. Two coastal cities, however, remained Spanish-controlled and continue to be contested symbols in the Moroccan national imagination. Independence did not automatically settle Morocco's internal political balance. French rule had expanded roads, ports, and commercial agriculture, and it had added modern districts to cities. But much of the economy had been built around colonial priorities and managed by Europeans. Politically, the Protectorate had left Morocco with few developed constitutional habits. The monarchy had retained broad theoretical authority, and once independence arrived, the king stood at the centre of the system. A first cabinet was formed to represent multiple strands of society, including Morocco's Jewish minority, and a non-partisan military figure was chosen to lead the government. The monarch, however, selected ministers personally and retained control over security forces. A consultative body was created, but real power remained concentrated in the palace. The new state also had to deal with armed groups that had fought for liberation. Royal leadership moved to integrate these irregular forces into a national military, even as some of them continued to support conflicts on the borders. Relations with France remained complicated. Morocco sympathised with Algerian independence and quietly supported it, which strained diplomacy. Yet Morocco still needed French expertise and financial support, so cooperation continued alongside political tension. Party politics soon fractured. In 1959, the Independence Party split into two main currents. One wing represented more traditional nationalist elites, while the other, led by younger intellectuals, leaned towards socialism and stronger republican themes. The king used these divisions to position himself above party conflict, acting as an arbiter while steadily preserving royal authority. Preparations for elected institutions continued. But the sudden death of the monarch in 1961 brought a new ruler to the throne. Hassan II, a figure determined to maintain control in a region full of coups and revolutionary ideologies. Elections were held in 1963, but the political system quickly slid into stalemate. Opposition forces formed around the old nationalist factions, while palace-aligned groups were assembled from rural and administrative networks, including a strong Amazigh base that opposed the dominance of old urban nationalists. When the parliament produced deadlock, the king dissolved it after a short period and returned to a model of strong personal rule. New constitutional texts were introduced in the early 1970s, promising new legislative arrangements, but attempted coups by military officers repeatedly shook the regime. The early 1970s saw dramatic plots against the monarchy, followed by harsh reprisals, mass detentions, and a climate of fear. A prominent opposition leader living abroad disappeared after being seized in Europe, and the event became a lasting symbol of the era's brutality. Later, elections delivered overwhelming victories for palace supporters, but many Moroccans believed the results were shaped behind the scenes. In the mid-1970s, Morocco's claim over Western Sahara became a defining issue. The monarchy's determined push to absorb the territory generated a surge of nationalist emotion and boosted the king's popularity. It also brought long-term costs: war, diplomatic isolation from some neighbours, and heavy financial strain. Through this period, royal strategy combined selective co-optation of opposition leaders with periodic crackdowns, sustaining control while preventing unified resistance. By the early 1980s, economic hardship returned sharply. Poor harvests, slow growth, and the burden of the Sahara conflict increased pressure, and violent riots erupted in Casablanca in 1981. International lenders and human rights organizations began scrutinizing Morocco more closely, and the regime faced growing calls for reform. At the same time, officials feared the rise of radical Islamist movements, particularly with the example of unrest elsewhere in the region. Security services monitored militant networks closely, while broader society experienced a cautious widening of personal freedoms. During the 1990s, political life became somewhat more open, and limited liberalization allowed a sense of expanded space. Yet, direct criticism of the king and the royal family remained a red line. Symbolic steps, such as amnesties for long-held political prisoners and public limits on police power, suggested a shift toward legality and human rights language, even though the system stayed tightly bounded. In foreign affairs, independent Morocco often followed a path different from many Arab states. During the Cold War, it generally aligned with Western powers, rather than leaning toward the Soviet bloc. The monarchy also maintained unusual channels in Middle East diplomacy, encouraging compromise between Israelis and Palestinians, and keeping informal contacts that many other governments avoided. Morocco supported Western-led coalitions during major regional crises and cultivated a relationship with Jewish communities of Moroccan origin, who had emigrated abroad, maintaining a cultural and familial bridge that remained rare in the region. In the mid-1970s, Morocco's monarchy placed the question of the Spanish Sahara at the centre of public life. King Hassan II treated the territory not only as a foreign policy priority, but also as a powerful symbol at home, a cause that could unite competing factions and quiet internal doubts. International observers, however, were sending a different message. A United Nations visit reported that many people in the territory leaned toward independence and that the future should be decided through a process of self-determination. Hassan answered with a move designed to seize the political initiative without firing a shot. In November 1975, tens of thousands of volunteers were mobilized, and marched across the border without weapons, presenting the world with an image of a mass civilian claim rather than a conventional invasion. The event was framed as a patriotic demonstration, and it placed Spain in a position where a confrontation risked spiralling beyond control. Spain chose withdrawal over escalation. An agreement soon followed in which Spain stepped away from its claim, and administration of the territory was set to pass to Morocco and Mauritania. The name Western Sahara began to replace the older colonial label. But the change in terminology did not settle the central dispute. By early 1976, the last Spanish forces had left, and the conflict shifted from a question of decolonization into a struggle over sovereignty. Morocco now faced a determined guerrilla movement, the Polisario Front, which presented itself as the voice of Saharan independence and built a government in exile. Algeria backed Polisario strongly, and Libya later added support, turning the issue into a regional rivalry as well as a local war. As the fighting intensified, Morocco looked for a political exit that would still secure its preferred outcome. In 1981, Hassan announced readiness to hold a referendum, a proposal meant to project confidence and reasonableness. Polisario rejected it, arguing that the plan was structured to favour Moroccan control, and that the core question of voter eligibility and political conditions had not been resolved fairly. The conflict continued across desert expanses, where visibility and distance shaped every tactical decision. Over time, Morocco fortified positions and expanded control over key areas. By the mid-1980s, defensive walls and fortified lines helped Morocco hold roughly 2/3 of the territory, creating a hard-edged map on the ground that did not match the diplomatic uncertainty at the United Nations. Meanwhile, the Saharan Arab Democratic Republic, operating outside the territory, gained recognition from a growing number of states. Each new recognition strengthened Polisario's claim to international legitimacy, even as Morocco deepened its physical hold over strategic zones. For a brief moment in the late 1980s, a shift seemed possible. Morocco and Algeria began exploring improved relations, and a United Nations peace framework gained traction. Morocco accepted a UN-sponsored proposal in 1988, and the atmosphere suggested that negotiation might finally outrun the battlefield. Yet, momentum did not last. Renewed Polisario attacks in the following year hardened Morocco's position again, and Hassan halted talks, arguing that violence made diplomacy impossible. In 1991, a UN Security Council plan promised the most concrete path toward a final decision in many years. A referendum that would offer a choice between integration with Morocco and independent statehood. On paper, it looked like the cleanest resolution imaginable. In practice, it revealed the deepest problem. Neither side trusted the other on the question that mattered most: who would be allowed to vote? Morocco and Polisario feared that the wrong voter list could lock in defeat, so the process stalled in disputes over eligibility, identity records, and political safeguards. UN mediation did achieve progress on humanitarian questions, including arrangements related to detainees and prisoners. But the referendum itself remained trapped in procedural deadlock. The ceasefire held more than the political settlement did, and the unresolved status of Western Sahara continued to shape relations between Morocco and its neighbours. As the 1990s progressed, King Hassan II's rule entered a final phase marked by careful image management and controlled political openings. By the end of that decade, he was widely seen as one of the longest ruling monarchs in the Arab world. The state promoted a narrative of reform and gradual liberalisation, and the political climate did change in visible ways. New constitutional adjustments and broader political space culminated in a breakthrough that would have seemed unlikely decades earlier. an opposition-led government took office, ending a long period in which the palace's allies dominated formal power. Opposition parties gained the largest bloc in the legislature in 1997, and in 1998 a veteran figure from the socialist camp, Abderrahmane Youssoufy, was appointed Prime Minister. For many Moroccans, the appointment suggested that the monarchy was willing to share responsibility for governing during a difficult economic and social era. Human rights pressure also influenced state behaviour. A campaign against corruption removed powerful officials, and in dramatic cases the state imposed severe punishments. Thousands of detainees, including individuals held for decades, were released, and the country's public language began to shift toward legality and rights. Yet the reforms had clear limits. The monarchy retained decisive authority. The power to dismiss governments, block legislation, and govern under emergency rules remained intact. Liberalisation existed, but it existed under a ceiling that the palace controlled. Hassan also invested in symbolic projects designed to strengthen emotional loyalty, particularly among rural communities and the urban poor. One of the most striking was the completion of a vast mosque on the shoreline in Casablanca in the early 1990s, financed through a mix of state coordination and public donations. It was built on a monumental scale, with engineering features meant to inspire awe and a highly visible beacon pointed toward the sacred direction of prayer. The project broadcast an image of a king who was modern in infrastructure, yet anchored in religious legitimacy. That religious legitimacy, however, also became a point of friction. Islamist movements were among the monarchy's most persistent challenges, and the state sought to constrain them within strict boundaries. Even so, Hassan occasionally used selective clemency to diffuse tension. Some religiously linked prisoners were pardoned, and a prominent Islamist leader was released after years under restriction, gestures that signalled flexibility without conceding authority. When Hassan died in July 1999, his son Mohammed VI inherited not only the throne but also a country in the middle of social debate and political transition. Early in the new reign, one major controversy rose above others: proposals to expand women's rights and widen women's access to education, public employment, and fairer treatment in family law. Supporters framed these ideas as overdue reforms that would modernize society and strengthen citizenship. Opponents argued that the changes threatened religious and cultural foundations. Large demonstrations filled streets in Casablanca and Rabat, with rival crowds promoting sharply different futures. The debate exposed a broader struggle over identity: how Morocco could balance conservative social structures with demands for equality and expanded rights. In the early 2000s, the country also faced a surge of violence linked to extremist networks. Bombings and attacks shook public confidence and pushed the state towards stronger security policies. The government responded with tighter surveillance and harsher measures against suspected militants, arguing that stability required firmness. These choices reshaped daily life as public space narrowed in some ways, even while political language continued to include reform and modernization. The result was a society moving in two directions at once: pressure for expanded rights and representation on one side, and stronger security restrictions on the other. South and east of Morocco, the story of Sudan unfolds along a different geography, but with a similarly long timeline, shaped by the Nile and by the movement of peoples across deserts, savannas, and river corridors. Sudan sits in northeastern Africa, and its history is closely connected to Egypt's, not simply because of proximity, but because the Nile binds them into a shared corridor of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. The capital, Khartoum, lies near the confluence of major river branches, a location that has attracted settlement for thousands of years. Long before states and dynasties, early communities lived near this region in deep prehistory. In the Middle Stone Age, groups of hunters and gatherers moved through the landscape, leaving behind tools and evidence of early pottery traditions. Over time, as the climate and resources shifted, domesticated animals became part of life, and herding and sedentary practices expanded in some areas. These communities were not isolated. Contacts linked them to cultures farther north in pre-dynastic Egypt, though the harsh terrain between Egypt and Nubia limited large-scale settlement moving southward in the earliest phases. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, the balance changed. Egypt's early dynastic rulers pushed beyond their southern frontier, extending military control into Upper Nubia and bringing Egyptian cultural influence into the riverbank communities. Over the centuries that followed, expeditions repeatedly entered Nubia in search of labour, resources, and materials for royal projects. These raids and campaigns disrupted local societies, and the blend of cultures that emerged from early contact was often broken by violence. Nubian communities along the Nile, vulnerable to stronger northern armies, endured cycles of intrusion and extraction. Yet cultural influence did not flow in only one direction. The constant movement of people, goods, and captives created channels through which African traditions reached Egypt as well. Nubians taken north as enslaved people or recruited as auxiliaries carried their skills, beliefs, and visual traditions into Egyptian society, contributing to shifts in art, religion, and cultural practice over time. Even in periods of heavy Egyptian pressure, Nubian life continued, adapting along the river while remaining distinct. After roughly the late 3rd millennium BC, a new demographic wave entered Nubia from the west. As parts of the Sahara became drier, groups moved toward the Nile, bringing cattle-based livelihoods and new social patterns. Some of these migrants pushed toward the Red Sea hills, while others moved deeper into the interior toward regions that later histories would know as Darfur and Wadai. Egypt, weakened by internal upheaval after the fall of an older dynasty, could not maintain constant pressure to the south. That gap created space for local development. The newcomers merged with existing Nubian populations, and a more independent Nubian civilization took shape with its own crafts, settlement forms, and social structures. When Egypt regained strength, it returned to the south. What began as tribute-taking expeditions hardened into occupation. By the time of Egypt's powerful Middle Kingdom, control extended deep into Nubia, supported by a chain of forts that guarded the river and enforced authority. Nubians resisted as best they could, and Egyptian control depended heavily on military infrastructure rather than consent. Trade pushed even farther south than official borders, and fortified posts were established to protect commerce from raids by groups beyond the frontier. Alongside conflict, exchange continued. Goods, luxury items, and cultural forms moved up and down the river, creating a complex frontier world. Out of this landscape, the kingdom known as Kush developed and endured. Even with Egyptian garrisons nearby, local culture flourished, shaped by influences from the south as well as the north. The decline of Egypt's direct power during later periods did not erase Egyptian cultural impact. In fact, Nubians serving as mercenaries within Egypt absorbed Egyptian ideas more deeply through daily military life than they had through earlier occupation. At the same time, the presence of Nubian soldiers in Egypt strengthened African influence within Egyptian society. When Egypt expelled foreign rulers from its own territory and entered a renewed phase of expansion, Nubia once again became a priority. A third occupation reached far into what is now northern Sudan, and proved more systematic and longer-lasting than earlier ones. Administration divided the region into zones with separate centres, ruled through a viceroy answerable to the pharaoh and supported by Egyptian officials. Egyptian colonies developed around administrative hubs, with priests, merchants and soldiers living near the machinery of power. Beyond these centres, many Nubians kept their own traditions, crafts, and communal structures. A blended culture emerged, neither purely Egyptian nor purely local, but something shaped by constant contact. Kush benefited from geography. Its position along major trade routes linked the Nile to the Red Sea and to deeper routes south and west. The riverine lands were fertile, and mineral wealth in the hills produced valuable resources that fed international exchange. Nubian soldiers were prized, and the region's value as both a corridor and a resource base ensured it remained important even when political control shifted. When Egypt weakened again late in its New Kingdom era, Kush's leaders and armies grew more autonomous. Over time, rulers in Kush became independent kings, and eventually Kushite dynasts moved north into Egypt itself. By the 8th century BC, Kush held Upper Egypt, and under a powerful ruler, the administration spread across the Nile Valley toward the Mediterranean. This moment of Kushite expansion was dramatic, but it collided with a new imperial force. Assyrian armies entered Egypt with superior weaponry and forced Kush's retreat. By the mid-7th century BC, Kush was driven back into Nubia, where it survived behind harsh terrain that limited northern pursuit. Even reduced from empire to regional kingdom, Kush remained a cultural power for centuries. While Egypt passed under Persian, Greek, and Roman influence, Kush preserved a distinct identity. It developed its own language, traditions, and scripts over time and adapted Egyptian religious forms without surrendering local beliefs. Royal burials used pyramids, but in styles that reflected a different aesthetic and political meaning from those in Egypt. The capital later moved farther south to Meroe, a shift that drew the kingdom into deeper contact with African cultures to the south, even as ties with Egypt weakened. Over many generations, Kush declined gradually, eventually ending when a rising power from the Ethiopian highlands defeated Meroe and shattered its weakened urban centres. After Kush's fall, the region entered an obscure era where sources are thin and the political map is difficult to reconstruct. New groups appeared along the Nile, inheriting aspects of Meroitic crafts and customs. At times, they were strong enough to raid northward, sometimes in cooperation with eastern nomadic peoples, provoking Roman retaliation from Egypt. Then, in the 6th century CE, the Middle Nile returned to the wider Mediterranean orbit through the arrival of Christian missionaries. 3 kingdoms formed along the river with their own capitals and political identities, and Christianity spread through them over several decades. Churches rose along the Nile, older religious structures were repurposed, and the new faith became embedded in state life. After the early missionary wave, the region again faded from outside view, continuing its own trajectory with limited documentation until Arab expansion reshaped the wider world. Following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies rapidly conquered vast territories. Egypt fell to Arab forces in the late 600s, and raiding parties moved south along the Nile frontier. The Nubian kingdom of the Middle Nile, strengthened through earlier consolidation, resisted fiercely. Raids and counter-raids escalated until a major Arab expedition pushed as far as the Nubian capital, besieging it and damaging its central church. Yet the attackers suffered heavy losses and a pragmatic settlement followed. Peace was secured through trade, an annual exchange of goods, and a strict understanding that limited settlement across the frontier. For centuries, this arrangement produced a relatively stable border. Arabs gained security without costly occupation of difficult terrain, and the Nubian kingdom preserved autonomy far longer than might have been expected. Over time, changes in Egypt altered the frontier balance. When new rulers took the Nile Delta and sought to manage nomadic pressures, Arab tribes were encouraged to move southward. Drawn by the promise of gold and pasture, nomadic groups pressed into Nubia, raiding and settling along the edges. The Nubian heartland remained intact for a time, but later, Egyptian regimes launched repeated campaigns into the region. These expeditions did not create lasting occupation, yet they devastated economic and political stability and weakened the Nubian state's ability to defend itself. By the 15th century, the old capital's strength had faded and the frontier was porous. As Arab groups migrated deeper, they intermarried with Nubian communities and carried Islamic culture into Christian lands. Inheritance customs and kinship systems shifted power dynamics across generations, and local authority fragmented. Nomadic institutions replaced centralized state structures in many areas, and the slow transformation of culture followed the movement of families and herds more than formal conquest. Farther south, the last major Christian kingdom along the Nile stood as a barrier for longer, supported by resources, iron-working traditions, and a prosperous capital with impressive buildings and gardens. Its Christianity persisted, though long isolation likely produced distinctive, local forms of worship and ritual. That southern kingdom weakened under persistent raiding and the long erosion of frontier stability. Eventually, Arab coalitions combined for a decisive assault. Around the beginning of the 16th century, the Christian state collapsed, its capital and surrounding regions abandoned. New powers emerged in the aftermath, taking control across the Blue Nile and the main river corridor. The Middle Nile entered yet another historical phase, shaped by fresh political formations and the continuing convergence of African and Arab worlds. Across the riverlands south of Egypt, a new power rose after the old Christian kingdoms faded. The Funge appeared in the Nile world like a sudden weather change, unexpected, hard to explain, and quickly decisive. They were not originally Arab, and their early identity sat outside the familiar categories of the region. Many accounts place their roots around the upper Blue Nile, in border country where cultures overlapped, and loyalties shifted between the highlands and the plains. Under a leader, remembered as Amara Dunkas, they established a political centre at Senna, and began a long struggle to control the fertile meeting ground between the Blue and White Niles. That central zone, with its fields, trade routes, and river crossings, was too valuable to be left to scattered tribes and rival chiefs. Through the 16th century, the Funge fought to dominate the region and to push back Arab groups who had settled near the confluence. By the early 17th century, their supremacy was clear enough that Senna became more than a capital. It became the symbol of a kingdom that could command the river corridors, rather than merely survive within them. The Funge state reached its greatest reach in the 17th century, when a powerful king expanded authority westward and tightened control along the Nile. Tribute began to flow from communities that had once acted independently, and the Fungi court projected influence into Kordofan and beyond. Yet the same expansion that built prestige also transformed the kingdom's internal balance. Conquests brought captives, and captives became soldiers. Over time, a large slave-based military force took shape in Senna, loyal first to the ruler, who fed and promoted it. As that military class grew in numbers and confidence, it stopped being a tool and started becoming a political actor. Offices that once belonged to hereditary elites became prizes fought over by men whose power came from the barracks, rather than the lineage. Court politics hardened into rival camps, and rivalry became rebellion. The old aristocracy found itself challenged by a force that had been created to secure the throne. In the 18th century, the struggle inside the Funge state became more decisive than the pressures outside it. One ruler broke the power of traditional nobles and ruled more directly, supported by slave troops that could enforce obedience. For a time, that arrangement produced stability because fear can resemble order when no one dares test it. But dependence on an army is a dangerous bargain. When the ruler's grip weakened, the same soldiers who guarded the throne could also remove its occupant. A strong man rose from the provinces, operating through the machinery of command rather than the rituals of royal legitimacy. The king was pushed aside, and real authority shifted to chief ministers and military patrons. After that turning point, Fungi rulers increasingly looked like monarchs in ceremony, but not in control. Viziers competed against one another, alliances formed and collapsed, and the state gradually lost coherence. The kingdom did not fall immediately because no single rival was ready to replace it. But slow disintegration can be just as final as sudden conquest. By the early 19th century, the Funge polity was exhausted, hollowed out by factional conflict and vulnerable to a determined external advance. While political power in Sennar wavered, the religious landscape was changing in ways that would outlast dynasties. The Fungi elite eventually adopted Islam, though conversion did not erase older customs, and practice often carried strong local colour. The more decisive transformation happened among settled communities along the Nile, where Islam moved from an identity marker into daily discipline. Teachers and holy men arrived over generations from wider Muslim networks. But the faith took deeper root through local figures who built schools, gathered students, and connected villages to a broader spiritual world. In many places, devotional practice became shaped, less by rigid legalism and more by mystical traditions that emphasized piety, discipline, and spiritual training. Brotherhood networks linked towns and river settlements to currents of learning beyond Sudan, creating pathways for ideas, teachers, and authority. Over time, religious leaders became more than guides for worship. They educated, mediated disputes, and helped place followers into administrative roles. This gave spiritual lineages political weight, and it meant that Islam spread not only through preaching, but also through social opportunity and community trust. That religious world contained an inner tension that later rulers would struggle to manage. On one side stood locally rooted teachers, close to the people and speaking their language of custom. On the other side stood more formal jurists and officials who represented state-backed orthodoxy and often arrived as outsiders, linked to government bureaucracy. The contrast could create rivalry: mysticism versus legalism, village authority versus official hierarchy. Sometimes the tension remained quiet, a matter of suspicion and distance. At other times, in moments of crisis, it became open hostility. Yet both strands remained part of Sudan's religious fabric, and over time many communities learned to recognize each as legitimate in its own place. The turning point that ended the Funge era did not come from a local contender, but from the north. In the early 19th century, Egypt's ruler, acting under the wider Ottoman umbrella, sent an army south with a clear purpose: secure wealth, secure manpower, and secure the river hinterland that stretched beyond Egypt's traditional reach. The Sudan was seen as a reservoir of gold, a source of enslaved labour, and a strategic depth that could not be left uncontrolled. By the time the invaders reached Sennar, the Funge state could not mount a unified defence. Submission followed, and Egyptian rule extended across a vast sweep of territory from Nubia toward the Ethiopian foothills and west toward Darfur. A new political order arrived with new demands, especially taxes extracted in ways many locals experienced as seizure rather than administration. Resistance flared quickly, and early rule was marked by anger and reprisals. A major revolt erupted, and the invading commander was killed, but rebellion without coordination is vulnerable to disciplined retaliation. The suppression was harsh, leaving behind a climate of fear and resentment. Yet Egyptian administration did not remain constant. A later Governor-General introduced reforms that changed the tone of rule. Taxes were reduced and reorganized. Local leaders were consulted, and amnesties drew fugitives back from the margins. Trade routes received protection, and Khartoum developed into a central administrative hub. These years demonstrated a pattern that would repeat. The same system could feel predatory under one governor and tolerable under another, not because the underlying goals changed, but because methods and restraint did. After this relatively effective phase, the administration drifted again. Governors rotated quickly, plans were abandoned, and projects decayed. The army and bureaucracy became complacent, and ordinary people, always sensitive to the behavior of officials, grew alienated. At mid-century, Egypt experimented with reorganizing the Sudan by weakening the central governor-generalship and making provinces answer directly to Cairo. The change did not solve the deeper problem: a distant state trying to control a vast land through a fragile chain of officials and garrisons. During this period, two developments created lasting tension. External pressure from European powers pushed Egypt to curb the slave trade, a practice deeply embedded in regional economies and networks. Decrees were issued, but decrees could not instantly dismantle a system supported by profit, armed force, and habit. Efforts to restrict it provoked resistance among those whose livelihoods depended on it, and confusion among communities that blamed the government for any sudden hardship. At the same time, the visible growth of a European and Christian presence in Sudan's commercial and administrative life inflamed suspicion. Many merchants lived inside their own circles, working closely with Turco-Egyptian officials and adopting their style, forming a distinct group that locals often viewed as protected outsiders. Even when tolerated, they became symbols of foreign influence during economic difficulty. A new Egyptian ruler then pursued bigger ambitions. Educated in European capitals and captivated by modernizing visions, he wanted Egypt and Sudan to become a modern state, with new technology, expanded territory, and a stronger place in the global order. Expansion up the White Nile was presented as both strategic and moral, especially when framed as a campaign against slavery. This is where politics, money, and ideology fused. European investors were more willing to fund modernization when reforms looked convincing, and anti-slavery measures offered diplomatic approval. As a result, the push into the equatorial regions and the attempt to suppress slave networks became intertwined with the arrival of more European officials tasked with carrying out reform. Exploration and conquest moved upriver. A foreign commander was sent to extend Egyptian influence into the south and disrupt slave traffic along the Nile. He established new administrative structures, created a province in the equatorial zone, and tried to anchor Cairo's authority far beyond traditional borders. His success was partial. Some groups were subdued and some routes disrupted, but resistance remained, and cultural frictions grew between foreign officials, Muslim administrators, and local societies. More importantly, suppressing slave trade along the river did not eliminate the deeper system to the west, where powerful merchants had built armed empires in the plains. Their stations, guarded by enslaved soldiers, funneled captives across long overland routes to markets in the north. Cairo faced a dilemma. crush these networks and risk a costly war, or absorb their leaders and claim nominal control. The state chose absorption in at least one key case, appointing a dominant slaver as governor in the west. The move extended the flag on maps, but it also allowed exploitation to continue under official cover, proving how easily reform rhetoric could bend under political necessity. Another foreign officer, famous for military exploits elsewhere, was brought in to govern and to intensify the anti-slavery drive. He travelled relentlessly, shutting markets, arresting traders, and imposing a rapid transformation by force. The campaign was energetic, but it carried a fatal weakness. It treated a complex social and economic system as if it were merely a criminal enterprise that could be smashed without consequences. The crackdown disrupted livelihoods and trade, and many Sudanese began to interpret the campaign through religious and cultural fear. A crusade led by foreigners and Christians was easily framed as an attack on Islam, especially when official jurists aligned with the government appeared distant and unsympathetic. Economic depression, administrative arrogance, and cultural suspicion blended into a single story that spread quickly in villages and among nomads. Then, the financial foundation collapsed. Egypt's ruler, drowning in debt, could no longer meet obligations. European powers moved to supervise finances, and the ruler was forced out. The reforming governor resigned. Sudan was left in a dangerous condition. Distrustful, economically strained, and politically fragile. Experienced officials had departed, the bureaucracy had lost confidence, and the system depended on a governor-general ill-equipped to command authority at a time when authority itself was being questioned. In this climate, a religious figure stepped forward with a claim that electrified the country. Muhammad Ahmad, raised in a devout environment and trained within a mystical tradition, had withdrawn to an island in the White Nile to live in ascetic discipline. He had travelled, listened, and observed the anger of people burdened by taxes, corruption, and humiliation. He saw more than bad government. He saw a spiritual crisis, a faith that, in his view, had been distorted by rigid official religion and compromised by collaboration with outsiders. He declared himself the Mahdi, a divinely guided renewer who would cleanse society and restore religion to its pure origins. In a society used to holy men, his claim was extraordinary, but its timing gave it power. Many believed a new age was approaching, and his appearance seemed to match an expectation of renewal after darkness. His movement gathered different groups with different hopes. Religious teachers who resented the government-backed jurists saw in him a purifier who would break official authority and elevate local holiness. Merchants and interests damaged by anti-slavery campaigns saw a chance to regain influence under a banner of sacred struggle. Most decisive of all were the cattle nomads of the West, hardened by warfare, hostile to taxes and contemptuous of distant officials. They became the striking force of the revolution, numerous, fearless, and driven by belief and grievance. The government, instead of crushing the movement early, handled it clumsily. Attempts to arrest the Mahdi failed and made him look protected by destiny. Each misstep increased his prestige. Within a short time, the Mahdists seized control across Kordofan. A major Egyptian force marched to crush them and was annihilated. That defeat changed everything. After that, the old order was collapsing in real time, and even dramatic last-minute efforts could not reverse it. Khartoum fell, and the famous defender sent to hold it was killed along with many others. The Mahdist revolution had taken the state. The Mahdi did not rule long. He died suddenly, leaving a movement that had conquered but not yet stabilized. Leadership passed to his chief successor, known as the Khalifa, who first had to secure his position against rival factions inside the new regime. Conspiracies were broken, private retinues were disarmed, and the capital at Omdurman became the centre of a new, tightly controlled state. With internal threats reduced, the Khalifa pursued an ambitious vision: carry the revolution outward, spread the Mahdist message across the region, and reshape the Muslim world through war and expansion. The goal combined genuine religious zeal with the logic of power, and it assumed that courage and belief could overcome political realities far beyond Sudan. For a time, Mahdist armies moved in multiple directions, winning battles and reaching new frontiers. But expansion without resources becomes exhaustion. Control in the west remained unstable. Victories in the east did not translate into lasting gains, and southern advances were eventually pushed back by forces linked to European colonial power. In the north, the Mahdist state suffered a crushing defeat near the Egyptian frontier, where better-equipped armies demonstrate a new balance of warfare shaped by modern weapons and organization. After that, the regime contracted. Famine, disease, and epidemic followed bad harvests, and the population endured one of the harshest periods in memory. Later seasons improved. Food returned, and survival became less desperate, allowing the state to stabilize. Autocratic rule, harsh as it was, began to feel familiar within a society shaped by long experience of centralized authority. Many accepted the Khalifa's government not out of romance, but out of recognition that order, even stern order, could be preferable to chaos. The British occupation of Egypt in the early 1880s reshaped politics far beyond Cairo. Officially, it began as an attempt to crush a nationalist revolt and stabilize the government in Egypt. But it quickly became something more permanent. Once British troops stayed, a new strategic obsession took hold. The Nile had to remain secure. Egypt's survival depended on its river, and the real danger was not an African state upstream, but another European power with the engineering capacity and the ambition to interfere with the water that fed the delta. From this point on, the Nile Valley became a chessboard. London worked through treaties, pressure, and quiet threats to keep rivals away from the river's lifeline. Agreements helped blunt Italian and German designs. But the rivalry that mattered most was with France, where political leaders kept insisting that Britain had no right to remain in Egypt indefinitely. When it became clear that the British were not leaving, French planners began searching for leverage. The boldest concept was to reach the Upper Nile from the far west, plant a flag at a key point, and create a bargaining chip that could force negotiations. The destination was Fashoda, a remote settlement on the river, where it was imagined that a future dam or fortified position might give France a way to threaten the Nile's flow, and thereby Britain's hold on Egypt. The plan was vast and slow. The expedition left the Atlantic side of Africa and began its grueling march eastward under Captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand. As news of his progress filtered back to Europe, the problem became painfully obvious in London. The Nile Valley was not sealed off at all. British officials tried to improvise ways to beat the French to the river, but one scheme after another collapsed under distance, terrain, and time. By late 1897, the conclusion hardened into policy. Protecting the Nile meant controlling the Sudan. There was no other practical way to stop a rival power from arriving at the river's upper reaches. An Anglo-Egyptian army was therefore ordered south, led by Horatio Herbert Kitchener. The campaign advanced steadily up the Nile with careful logistics, railways, and gunboats supporting the march. A major Mahdist force was defeated near the Atbara River in the spring of 1898. Then came months of preparation for a final battle that would decide the fate of the Mahdist state. Outside Omdurman, Kitchener's army met the Khalifa's much larger host. The engagement ended quickly by the standards of earlier Sudanese warfare. Superior firepower and organisation crushed the massed assault. The Mahdist army suffered catastrophic losses. The Khalifa escaped into flight, and the old revolutionary state was effectively broken. He would be hunted down and killed the following year. Victory at Omdurman did not close the story. Kitchener moved upriver with a small flotilla and reached Fashoda, where Marchand's exhausted detachment had already arrived. Neither side wanted to retreat, and the encounter produced a dangerous standoff. In Paris and London, preparations for conflict accelerated, but France faced an uncomfortable reality. The country was not ready for war at sea or on land. The crisis ended with France stepping back, and an agreement soon followed that drew a line across Africa and set a limit to French expansion toward the Nile. The immediate danger to Britain's position in Egypt was removed, but the price was a new political arrangement in Sudan that would shape the next half-century. Having seized Sudan, Britain still had to decide what it had actually conquered. The war had been fought under the banner of an Anglo-Egyptian force, and Egyptian funds and soldiers had carried much of the burden. Yet British opinion did not want Sudan simply handed to Cairo, partly because many believed Egyptian administration had helped create the conditions for the earlier uprising. A compromise solution was announced in 1899. Sudan would be governed as a condominium, a joint sovereignty shared in theory by Egypt's ruler and the British Crown. 2 flags were raised side by side, and a governor-general was formally appointed by Egypt's Khedive, but chosen through British authority. In practice, the partnership was unequal from the start. Britain held the real power, and Egyptian influence was limited and carefully controlled. The early years of the new regime were shaped by security first and development second. British officials moved quickly to crush scattered revolts and prevent religious uprisings from spreading. In the north, pacification came relatively fast, and civilian administrators began to replace military officers. Roads, communications, and basic structures of government expanded. In the south, resistance proved harder and more persistent, and the colonial approach became more cautious. Keeping order mattered more than modernizing. This created a widening gap between regions, with the north more directly integrated into the new state, while the south was managed with a lighter, more defensive hand. Kitchener served briefly as the first Governor-General, but his successor, Reginald Wingate, became the defining figure of the era. Wingate knew Sudan's terrain and politics intimately and stayed in office for many years. His administration relied on a mix of firmness and cautious respect. A Muslim, Arabic-oriented society was being ruled by Christian outsiders, and that fact could not be ignored. Winning compliance required not only force but also a degree of predictability and restraint that allowed local elites and communities to adapt without feeling permanently humiliated. Modernization arrived slowly, partly by design. Taxes were kept low to avoid provoking backlash, but low taxes meant thin budgets. For years, the Sudanese administration depended on financial support from Egypt. Even so, the state invested in infrastructure where it served strategic and economic goals. Railways and telegraphs spread. River transport expanded. The Gezira region became a priority because it offered the chance to build a cotton economy linked to global markets, and that project would later become the backbone of Sudan's export system. Schools also multiplied, including a major college in Khartoum that trained a new class of educated Sudanese. The emergence of that small elite was one of the most consequential changes of all, because it created a group that could read the modern world, compare systems, and imagine political alternatives. The colonial administration had an uneasy relationship with these new graduates. Many British officials preferred dealing with traditional leaders who demanded little and accepted authority quietly. Educated young men, by contrast, were seen as argumentative, impatient, and difficult to control. At the same time, the graduates were no longer fully anchored in older tribal or religious structures. They often found themselves floating between worlds, respected for literacy but distrusted for new ideas. In that vacuum, Egyptian nationalism became an attractive reference point. The Nile was not only a river but also a shared political language, and contacts with Egyptian activists helped shape early Sudanese nationalist thought. Nationalist agitation became visible in the early 1920s through new associations and political groupings. Activists were arrested, demonstrations erupted in Khartoum, and the authorities responded with suppression. The moment that hardened British policy came in 1924 after the assassination of the Governor-General in Cairo. Britain reacted by forcing Egyptian officials out of Sudan and crushing a Sudanese military mutiny that had shown sympathy for Egypt. The revolt ended quickly, but the consequences lasted. Britain tightened control, reduced Egyptian presence, and faced little direct challenge until the global disruptions of World War II changed political calculations again. Meanwhile, Sudanese political awareness continued to grow, especially among the educated. A treaty between Britain and Egypt in the mid-1930s reopened the door for Egyptian officials to return. But it also created resentment among Sudanese who realized that their future was being negotiated without their participation. Graduates organized themselves more formally, and what began as an alumni network soon became a platform for political demands. The colonial government refused to recognize it as a national representative body, and internal divisions followed. A moderate current believed cooperation could gradually expand Sudanese influence. A radical current looked to Egypt for support and pressed for faster change. From these tensions, modern party politics took shape. One current rallied around the idea of close association with Egypt, backed by major religious networks that could mobilize followers. Another current formed around the vision of Sudanese independence and cooperation with Britain as a path to self-rule, supported by a different religious establishment. This was not only a battle of policies, it was a competition between powerful spiritual communities whose rivalries ran deep. Party life became entangled with sectarian loyalties, and the struggle for national direction turned into a struggle between social blocs. That pattern would haunt Sudanese parliamentary politics for decades, often narrowing democracy to a contest among elites, rather than a broad national conversation. British officials, aware that nationalism among the educated could not be ignored forever, tried to channel it through new institutions. Advisory bodies were created in the north, and later, the move toward a legislative council forced a major policy shift regarding the south. For years, colonial rule had been eased by keeping the largely non-Muslim south politically separated from the Muslim north. Building a central legislature made that segregation harder to defend, and Southern participation was introduced in the late 1940s. The step was meant to create a single political framework, but it also exposed how different the regions were in language, religion, and historical experience. Egypt reacted sharply when Sudanese self-government began to look real. In the early 1950s, Cairo tried to reclaim Sudan by declaration, but the move largely backfired, alienating many Sudanese. The Egyptian Revolution of 1952 then brought leaders who handled the Sudan question with more flexibility. An agreement with Britain laid out a path to self-government and a timetable for self-determination. Elections followed. Egyptian backing helped a unionist party win decisively on a platform of Nile Valley unity, while its rivals argued for a separate independence. Yet governing changed the calculus. Southern unrest, administrative responsibility, and the realities of power pushed the new leadership away from earlier slogans. In early 1956, Sudan declared independence as a republic, with an elected parliament. The promise of parliamentary rule did not last. Democratic institutions had shallow roots compared with the weight of tradition and the power of sectarian loyalties. Parties often functioned less as disciplined organizations with clear programs and more as shifting alliances built on patronage, personal ambition, and religious affiliation. Parliament became a battleground for maneuver rather than a mechanism for solving national crises. As frustration spread, the political system lost legitimacy. The country drifted toward the familiar alternative: rule by force. A military coup in late 1958 brought a new regime that dissolved parties, restricted public life, and promised order and economic progress. The government moved quickly on practical measures, especially in cotton policy, and strengthened reserves by selling exports more aggressively. An agreement with Egypt settled key issues around Nile water and eased a major external pressure. But in the south, the regime pursued policies aimed at cultural and religious integration, pushing Arabic and Islam through administration and education, replacing missionary-led schooling with a more northern model, and expelling foreign missionaries. These measures deepened resistance rather than creating unity. Strikes and protests spread, students fled across borders, and an armed rebellion began to form into a guerrilla movement. The state responded with repression, and the southern conflict became the open wound of the nation. In the north, the Southern War became a catalyst for opposition. Intellectuals, unions, civil servants, and religious leaders turned against military rule, using the regime's failures as proof that authoritarianism could not manage the country's deepest problem. In 1964, students in Khartoum defied bans and held public meetings. Protests spilled into the streets, and the regime struggled to respond because much of the army was tied down in the south. The leader of the military government resigned, and a transitional administration took over under the old constitutional framework. Elections in the mid-1960s restored parliamentary life, but the old pattern returned quickly. Factional splits, rivalry inside parties, and paralysis over economics and the constitution. Hopes of a political settlement with the South faded again. In 1969, a group of young officers led by Ghaffar Nimeri seized power, claiming that the civilian system had failed and that the country needed a new foundation. Nimeri's early years were shaped by threats from multiple directions. The regime cracked down on communists and confronted religious-based opposition. An attempted coup in 1971 failed and pushed Nimeri to centralize authority further. A single ruling party was created, and the presidency became the core of the state. The most important shift, however, came from renewed efforts to end the Southern War. Southern forces that had been fragmented were unified under a single commander and political umbrella, and negotiations produced an autonomy agreement in 1972. The long conflict paused, Southern self-rule was established, and former rebels were integrated into national security structures. Nimeri gained international prestige and domestic support, and for a moment Sudan looked as if it might stabilize. Peace opened the door for ambitious economic plans. Money that had been consumed by war was redirected to development, and the oil boom in the Gulf brought new investment. Sudan was imagined as an agricultural engine that could feed the wider Arab world. Large projects expanded sugar, wheat, and cotton production, while infrastructure and canals were planned to reshape water and land use. The vision was grand, but implementation faltered. Projects ran late, costs spiraled, and output often failed to meet targets. By 1980, the economy was in deep trouble, trapped in inflation and debt. Weak planning allowed ministries to take loans without coherent oversight, creating fertile ground for corruption. External shocks compounded the damage. Rising oil prices increased import costs, while higher wages abroad pulled skilled Sudanese workers out of the country, draining expertise precisely when it was most needed. As economic strain grew, a disciplined Islamist movement began to rise within the state itself. It had once been electorally marginal, but under an organized and strategic leader, it focused on building influence rather than winning popularity. Recruitment targeted students, teachers, civil servants, and eventually officers. By the early 1980s, the movement had gained footholds inside the bureaucracy and security apparatus. Nimeyri, struggling to hold together coalitions and facing pressure from traditional parties and southern dissatisfaction, began to lean toward these Islamists. Legal and constitutional changes followed, culminating in the reshaping of national law to align more closely with Islamic codes in 1983. For many in the south, this was an unmistakable signal that the state was moving away from the spirit of the autonomy agreement. By the early 1980s, the Southern War had already reignited, even before any formal political settlement was openly dismantled. The ceasefire years after 1972 had not erased the underlying conflict between a northern state dominated by Arabic language and Islamic institutions and southern communities with different religious and cultural identities. Small flare-ups had appeared from time to time and were usually crushed. But in 1983, a turning point arrived. A battalion stationed in Bor broke ranks, mutinied, and disappeared into the countryside under the leadership of Colonel John Garang. The rebellion did not present itself as a brief local uprising. It quickly became the nucleus of a wider movement fueled by anger at corruption, exclusion, and the contempt many Southerners felt from Khartoum's political class. The mutineers found breathing space across the border in Ethiopia. From there, the ranks grew fast as disaffected Southerners joined a new armed organization, the Sudan People's Liberation Army, alongside a political wing that framed the struggle as a national project rather than a purely regional revolt. The new movement attracted recruits who believed that petitions and negotiations had repeatedly failed, and that only sustained pressure on the battlefield could force a different political order. In Khartoum, the first response was force. The central government tried to crush the rebellion militarily, but the war immediately collided with the fragile economy and the realities of feeding a vast country. Troop deployments disrupted markets and transport. Drought and poor harvests magnified the damage, and parts of the south slipped toward famine. As conditions worsened, criticism spread in the north as well. Nimeyri was increasingly attacked not only for the war but also for the severity of the new legal system, especially punishments associated with the state's Islamic turn. Facing pressure from multiple directions, the president attempted a late recalibration. Emergency powers were eased. Administrative steps that had inflamed the south were partly reversed. The harshest edges of the courts were softened. But the shift came too late to rebuild trust. In April 1985, Nimeyri was removed in a bloodless coup led by his own military leadership. The regime that followed promised a return to civilian rule, and elections brought Sadiq al-Mahdi back into the Prime Minister's office. Yet the next few years turned into a spiral of unstable coalitions and short-lived cabinets. Political parties maneuvered for advantage rather than building a durable strategy for peace. Attempts to negotiate with the southern rebels repeatedly stalled. The state seemed unable to decide whether to compromise, escalate, or redesign itself. That paralysis ended abruptly in June 1989, when a new group of officers seized power, led by Omar al-Bashir. The takeover was presented as a rescue mission for a collapsing country, but it quickly revealed a deeper political engine behind it. The new rulers were closely aligned with an Islamist current that had spent years building influence inside institutions. The Revolutionary Command Council became the instrument of that project. The leadership understood its weak popular base and moved immediately to neutralize the groups that had historically driven uprisings in Khartoum: professionals, unions, student networks, judges, and journalists. Hundreds of opponents were arrested. Parties and trade unions were banned. Newspapers were silenced. Courts were reshaped. A security system expanded rapidly, built to control public life rather than compete for consent. The war in the south was pursued with renewed intensity, although economic weakness limited what could be sustained. In the early 1990s, the state tightened its ideological course. Islamic law was reintroduced in a stricter form, including punishments meant to signal authority and moral discipline. Foreign policy choices deepened Sudan's isolation at a moment when it needed allies and investment. The economy deteriorated further under the weight of war, declining productivity and runaway inflation. Shortages spread through major cities and protests were met with severe repression. On the battlefield, the government struggled to hold territory. Rebel forces took towns in the south, while the army fought to keep control of key provincial centres such as Juba, Wau, and Malakal. Unable to win decisively through conventional battles, Khartoum leaned heavily on local militias. Armed Arab groups were mobilised in conflicts that often followed older rivalries and land disputes, with devastating effects on civilians. Entire communities were caught between government forces and the rebel army. Many areas were looted, burned, and emptied. Humanitarian relief became another battlefield, with aid efforts obstructed or restricted. Drought and displacement amplified the catastrophe. People fled toward northern cities, crossed borders into Ethiopia, or crowded into camps where hunger and disease were constant threats. The human cost rose not only from combat but from famine, exposure, and the collapse of basic services. In 1993, the ruling council formally stepped back from direct military rule and introduced a civilian facade. The change did not alter the power structure. Bashir was appointed president, and the political system remained under the firm grip of the same network. Elections in the mid-1990s restored the language of constitutional politics, and later reforms advertised a move toward pluralism. A new constitution was endorsed by referendum, and multi-party politics was announced, only to be limited again when the state moved to protect the presidency and restrict meaningful competition. At the same time, a new factor transformed the economy. Oil exports began, bringing badly needed revenue and strengthening the government's ability to finance the state and its security apparatus. Despite political reforms on paper, the war continued through most of the 1990s and into the early years of the next century. Talks and ceasefires came and went. Breakthrough proved difficult because the conflict was not only military but also constitutional, economic, and deeply tied to identity. Eventually, in 2005, a major peace agreement offered the clearest framework yet for ending the long war. It provided for a new constitutional order, plans for power sharing, wealth distribution, and security arrangements, and it recognized southern autonomy with a path toward a future referendum on independence. For many, it looked like the beginning of an exit from a conflict that had shaped an entire generation. Yet another crisis was already burning in the West. In Darfur, rebellion erupted in 2003 amid accusations that the region had been neglected, and its non-Arab communities treated as politically disposable. The state responded by backing armed Arab militias that fought the insurgents, but also targeted civilians, spreading terror across villages and blocking aid. The humanitarian disaster expanded rapidly, pushing huge numbers of people from their homes and leaving a trail of deaths and displacement that drew global attention. International efforts tried to impose ceasefires and deploy peacekeepers, first through African forces and later through a larger joint mission under United Nations authorization. Even with international troops on the ground, the crisis proved difficult to contain. In the early centuries after Islam spread across North Africa, the region that largely corresponds to modern Tunisia was widely known as Afriqiya. The name carried an older echo. Roman rulers had used a related word for Africa, and they also applied it to their first major foothold on the continent after their long wars with Carthage. When Roman power faded, authority shifted again and again. Germanic Vandals briefly ruled. Byzantium reasserted control, and then Arab armies arrived in the 7th century and absorbed the area into a new political and religious world. For a time, North Africa appeared to move under a broad umbrella of rule, but unity did not last. Local dynasties rose, and by the 13th century, Tunisia had its own line of rulers, distinct from neighbouring centres of power. Later waves of migration reshaped society in quieter but lasting ways. Muslims from Al-Andalus crossed the sea and settled in the region after losing ground in Iberia, with one of the biggest surges coming after the fall of Granada at the end of the 15th century. In the late 16th century, Tunisia was drawn into the Ottoman sphere. Istanbul's influence never fully eliminated local autonomy, and by the 19th century, Ottoman authority in the far west was weakening fast. Compared with its larger neighbours, Tunisia's small size had consequences. A single capital city dominated politics, culture, and administration far more than in the sprawling landscapes of Algeria or Morocco. Most people spoke Arabic, the overwhelming majority followed Islam, and a small Jewish community remained part of the social fabric. The country's location also mattered. Its coastline faced Europe, and its history had long included contact with Mediterranean powers. Roman-era North Africa had been deeply shaped by Christianity, and later the Islamic transformation spread early and widely in this region. Tunisia often found ways to preserve room for manoeuvre even while formally belonging to greater empires, but that flexibility did not mean safety. When the 19th century arrived, the country stood in a dangerous corridor between a rising Europe and a declining Ottoman world, with limited economic muscle and little military depth. The new era sharpened in 1830 when France invaded Algiers. Tunisia was still officially tied to the Ottoman Empire, yet in practice it ran its own affairs. Tunisian rulers watched France closely and tried to avoid provoking a takeover. One strategy was cautious cooperation, paired with polite assurances. But regional security grew more uncertain in the 1830s when the Ottoman state reasserted direct control in nearby Libya. Suddenly, Tunisia faced pressure from two sides. France loomed to the west, and Istanbul's renewed attention appeared to the east. For decades, Tunisian leaders tried to satisfy both while strengthening the state at home. A major reform drive unfolded under Ahmad Bey in the middle of the century. Determined to modernize, he relied heavily on European advisors and set out to build a more contemporary army and navy, along with industries that could support them. He introduced conscription, a move that alarmed rural communities and added to social strain. At the same time, he pushed for deeper participation by Arabic-speaking Tunisians inside a government that had long been shaped by Turkish elites and military households. Measures against slavery and other reformist steps aimed to present Tunisia as a state that could stand on modern terms. Yet every reform carried a price. The country's weak economy could not easily sustain costly projects, and modernization opened new doors for European influence and pressure. Debt grew, taxes climbed, and unrest simmered across the countryside. Later in the century, another push for reform arrived under Khayr al-Din, widely seen as one of the strongest statesmen in the region at that time. But domestic rivals and outside interference combined to bring his experiment down. Tunisia's diplomatic position worsened after the Congress of Berlin in 1878, when Britain effectively accepted French dominance over Tunisia. From that point on, the road toward French control became hard to block. In 1881, France moved in, using border incidents near Algeria as justification. The Treaty of Bardo formalized what force had already made real. French troops occupied the country, and the Tunisian ruler's authority over foreign policy and finances was largely transferred to France. Resistance broke out, especially in the south. French forces answered with a sequence of campaigns that captured key towns and tightened control. A second agreement, in 1883, the Convention of La Marsa, reinforced the protectorate and gave French officials greater leverage over administration, justice, and budgets. Tunisia's protectorate differed from Algeria's colonial experience in one important way. It was built through treaty mechanisms, rather than full annexation. The Tunisian ruler remained on the throne, ministries continued to exist, and everyday symbols of identity were not formally dismantled. Arabic remained the official language, and mosques were not turned into churches. But the centre of gravity had shifted. Real power rested with the French resident general, who supervised decision-making across the state. Under French direction, finances were stabilised and infrastructure expanded. Railways, ports, and communications were improved. Economic change followed a colonial pattern. Fertile lands in the north and strategic agricultural zones attracted European settlers, while the economy was increasingly oriented toward exports. Phosphate mining expanded, especially around Gafsa, and commercial farming developed in the best-watered valleys. Even without a dramatic mass seizure of land on Algeria's scale, control over prime resources moved steadily toward European hands. By the end of the 19th century, a small French-educated layer of Tunisians emerged and began to argue for reform and for a greater Tunisian role in governance. They did not begin with open rebellion. Their style was cautious and modernist, aimed at persuasion and gradual change. Newspapers became their primary tool, first in French and later in Arabic, reaching both Tunisian audiences and sympathetic Europeans who might push for softer policies. Yet even this restrained activism triggered repression in the early 1910s, limiting political space for years. After the First World War, Tunisian nationalism reorganized into clearer political forms. A party named for the earlier constitution demanded a constitutional system and equal civic rights. French authorities answered with arrests and pressure on the palace. When the ruler attempted to support nationalist demands, the residents responded with a show of force that made the limits of Tunisian autonomy unmistakable. A mix of small reforms and restrictions then cooled the movement temporarily. In the 1930s, a new generation of activists adopted a broader strategy. Habib Bourguiba and other young organisers broke with older leadership and created a party designed for mass mobilisation. They prioritised outreach, propaganda, and building a nationwide base. French suppression did not eliminate the party. It often increased its appeal. Brief openings in the mid-1930s were followed by renewed repression, and by 1938 the crackdown had become severe, with leaders arrested and the party formally dissolved. Then, the Second World War ripped through the political landscape. Nationalist figures were deported, released, moved again, and pressured by competing powers. Axis governments tried to lure Tunisian leaders into collaboration by offering recognition and status. Bourguiba avoided binding commitments, refusing to tie Tunisia's cause to the Axis project. As the war's balance shifted and Free French forces returned, the nationalist camp experienced bitter disappointment. The ruler who had shown sympathy was removed, and nationalist leaders faced renewed suspicion. Bourguiba escaped imprisonment and reached Egypt, where he continued the independence campaign from abroad, while building regional connections. By the early 1950s, the global environment made rigid colonial control harder to defend. The independence of other Arab states and the changing mood after the war pushed France toward concessions. Nationalist-aligned ministers briefly entered government and Bourguiba returned. But when local leaders demanded a parliament and deeper sovereignty, repression returned. Exile, arrests, and restrictions sparked a new phase, including guerrilla activity that destabilized the countryside and made normal administration difficult. In 1954, France announced a major shift, promising full internal autonomy through negotiation. Bourguiba returned and guided the process, managing the political balance without always taking a formal seat at the table. An agreement in 1955 granted autonomy but left France with strong influence in key areas. The deal split the nationalist leadership. Salah ben Youssef denounced it as too limited and tried to organize armed resistance in the south. The government crushed the effort quickly. Ben Youssef fled and was later killed in exile. Full independence arrived in March 1956. Bourguiba became prime minister, the monarchy was abolished, and Tunisia declared a republic in 1957, with Bourguiba as president. The new state moved rapidly on social reform. Education expanded, women's legal status changed dramatically, and the legal system was reshaped. Economic modernization moved more slowly. Planning efforts, including ambitious state-driven programs in agriculture, ran into opposition and failed to meet expectations. The fall of key architects of these policies pushed Tunisia toward a more conservative economic approach. Bourguiba's rule, once widely admired for its modernizing drive, became more centralized over time. Political openings appeared in limited form, including gestures toward multi-party politics, but electoral outcomes repeatedly favored the ruling party in ways that deepened opposition cynicism. At the same time, Islamist activism grew, organized around movements that challenged the ruling model and demanded a stronger religious orientation in public life. When social unrest and price protests erupted in the 1980s, the state responded with force and large-scale arrests. As Bourguiba's health declined, governance became more erratic and frustration spread. In 1987, he was removed from office after being declared unfit to rule. Zine El Abidine Ben Ali took power and promised a new era of political reform. Early steps were presented as national reconciliation, bringing together legal opposition figures and major institutions in a broad pact. Parties were legalized, though the most important Islamist movement was excluded from full participation and later faced intense repression. Elections continued to produce overwhelming victories for the president and the ruling party, while critics argued that political competition remained tightly managed. Over time, the gap between reform rhetoric and political reality widened. Activists and opponents accused the state of relying on security forces, restricting media, and weakening independent organizations. The government defended its approach by arguing that stability and economic modernization required gradual change and firm control. Tunisia pursued a foreign policy oriented toward economic opportunity and security. Under Bourguiba, ties with France and the United States were central, even as occasional crises erupted over border violence, military bases, and land nationalization. Tunisia also aimed to keep economic channels open to a wide range of partners, rather than committing fully to one bloc. Western Sahara sits along the Atlantic edge of northwestern Africa, a long stretch of coast backed by desert. Its political status has been contested for decades. Morocco claims the territory, but that claim has not gained universal international recognition. Many Sahrawis, the region's indigenous people, have pursued independence and in the 1970s proclaimed a state they call the Saharan Arab Democratic Republic, operating largely from exile. Long before modern borders, this landscape went through dramatic environmental change. The distant past is hard to map in detail, yet traces remain. Rock engravings from the Stone Age in areas such as Sagia, El Hamra, and scattered southern sites point to earlier communities that lived by hunting and herding, with small pockets of cultivation where water and soil allowed. Over time, the climate shifted toward increasing aridity, and the slow expansion of the desert reshaped human settlement and movement across the region. Even as the land dried, Western Sahara was never fully isolated. By classical antiquity, exchange networks connected North Africa to the wider Mediterranean world. Traders moved goods and information across sea routes, and seafarers explored the Atlantic-facing coastline. Phoenician voyages along West Africa belong to this broad era of coastal navigation, and Roman-era contacts reached into Saharan worlds as well, though often indirectly through trade and frontier intermediaries, rather than full conquest. In the medieval period, the population was shaped by layered migrations and shifting dominance. Berber-speaking Amazigh groups, including confederations tied to the wider Saharan belt, lived across this territory. Over time, Arabic-speaking Muslim Bedouin groups expanded their influence, especially from around the second millennium of the Common Era. The region's social life reflected mobility and adaptation. Clan ties, seasonal movement, and caravan routes mattered as much as fixed towns, because survival depended on water, pasture, and access to coastal or inland trade. Europe's coastal attention arrived unevenly. Portuguese sailors reached parts of the shoreline in the 14th century and recorded bays and landmarks, sometimes misidentifying them, or confusing one river mouth with another. For centuries, however, European exploration remained limited and sporadic. The coast offered few safe harbours and little immediate profit compared with other Atlantic routes. Still, small footholds appeared. A short-lived Spanish trading station was attempted in the late 15th century, but lasting control did not follow. Serious European commercial presence increased in the 19th century, when merchants and ships began to treat the coast as a possible node in wider Atlantic and Mediterranean trade. This gradual interest turned into formal colonization in the late 19th century. Spanish expeditions made agreements with coastal groups, and Madrid claimed a protectorate along the shore. Expansion beyond the coast proved difficult. France was asserting its own ambitions in nearby Mauritania, and local resistance also mattered. Religious and political leaders mobilized communities inland, and an oasis town such as Samarra became significant as a center of settlement and influence in an otherwise harsh interior. During the early 20th century, Spain extended its reach step by step. Control was established in certain coastal zones, then pushed into interior districts as military and administrative posts multiplied. By the 1930s, Spain had occupied Samarra and asserted authority more broadly across the territory. Even then, the region's realities limited what occupation meant on the ground. Vast distances, nomadic patterns of life, and the difficulty of supply kept many areas beyond close supervision. After Morocco achieved independence in the mid-1950s, the struggle over Western Sahara intensified. Morocco claimed the territory, and tensions rose into armed incidents. Spain managed to hold its positions and later merged the main districts into a single administrative unit known as Spanish Sahara. Yet a second claim emerged as Mauritania gained independence and argued that the territory should fall partly under its own historical sphere. A discovery in the 1960s changed the stakes. Major phosphate deposits were found near Boukra in the north, turning Western Sahara into more than a strategic frontier. The possibility of mineral wealth made possession far more valuable and raised the pressure on Spain. Industrial extraction began in the early 1970s, and the economic focus on phosphates reshaped local life, pulling people toward new work sites and infrastructure and increasing the political attention directed at the territory. At the same time, deeper forces were transforming society. Drought, further desertification, economic disruption, and the shock of rapid development fostered a stronger sense of political identity among Sahrawis. Anti-colonial sentiment grew, and an armed movement formed in the early 1970s, the Polisario Front. It presented itself as a liberation organization for the people of the territory and began guerrilla operations against Spanish rule. By the mid-1970s, Spain signaled that it would leave. What followed was not a clean handover, but a contested exit shaped by competing regional ambitions and global diplomacy. Morocco and Mauritania pressed their claims, and Spain, facing internal uncertainty and external pressure, accepted a partition plan rather than supervising a straightforward act of self-determination. International legal discussion at the time emphasized that historic claims by neighboring states did not cancel the Sahrawis' right to decide their own future. But the political settlement moved ahead anyway. Morocco took the northern portion, including the phosphate zone, while Mauritania took the south. The result was war. Polisario forces, based largely in Algeria and supported there, fought against both Moroccan and Mauritanian positions. Attacks targeted outposts, supply lines, and vulnerable points in a conflict shaped by desert mobility. In 1976, the Polisario movement declared a government in exile under the name Saharan Arab Democratic Republic, gaining recognition from a significant number of states over time, while continuing its military campaign. Mauritania eventually withdrew from the struggle, signing peace with Polisario in the late 1970s. Morocco responded by taking over the area Mauritania had held, extending Moroccan control southward. Over the following years, Morocco built a defensive system of walls and fortified zones to secure the most valuable and strategically important triangle in the north, including the mines, the main administrative centre at Laayoune, and interior points such as Samarra. Polisario guerrillas continued raids, but the new fortifications changed the battlefield and helped Morocco hold much of the territory it controlled. A diplomatic track gained momentum in the late 1980s. A United Nations plan proposed a referendum in which eligible Sahrawis would choose between independence and integration with Morocco. Both sides accepted the broad framework, and a ceasefire was agreed in 1991. International personnel arrived to support the process and prepare for a vote. Yet the core problem was not solved by the ceasefire. It shifted into administration, identification, and politics. The referendum depended on one defining question: who counts as a voter in a society shaped by nomadic history, movement across borders, and overlapping tribal identities? Morocco encouraged large numbers of settlers to move into the territory and insisted on reviewing their eligibility, while Polisario and its supporters argued for narrower lists tied to Sahrawi origin and earlier residency patterns. The verification process became slow, contested, and deeply mistrusted. The referendum did not take place as planned, and the dispute carried on through the 1990s and into the next century. On the ground, Morocco continued to build roads, public works, and administrative infrastructure in areas it held, arguing that development demonstrated effective governance. At the same time, protests and political resistance persisted among Sahrawis who rejected Moroccan rule. International mediation continued in cycles. Talks were held, proposals were floated, and informal negotiations were authorized again after earlier rounds failed to produce a breakthrough. Meanwhile, the independence movement faced its own pressures. Maintaining unity over many years proved difficult. Some members defected or drifted away, and regional politics shaped levels of support. Algeria remained a central backer of Sahrawi self-determination and continued its diplomatic advocacy, even as it faced internal challenges that affected the wider regional environment. Over time, tens of thousands of Western Saharans, including many linked to the Polisario movement, lived in semi-permanent refugee camps across the border in Algeria. These camps became not only places of refuge but also centres of political life, administration and identity for people whose homeland remained disputed. The story of Western Sahara, then, is not a single event but an extended collision of geography, decolonisation, resource politics and regional rivalry. A ceasefire reduced open warfare, yet the underlying question of sovereignty remained unresolved, caught between competing claims, stalled diplomacy, and the lived reality of a population split between occupied territory, diaspora communities, and long-term refugee camps.